Start. Okay. Good. So I'm very happy to see all of you here after yesterday's excellent dinner. So today we have 4 excellent presentations, and we're going to start with Martina Kirchberger from University College Dublin. Please.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone, for being here. I guess we're streaming, so hi, if anybody is awake there, tuning in. So I'm from Trinity College Dublin. I'm sure my university would want me to just clarify that. So thanks for the organizers for having me on the program. It's been really lovely so far. So this is work with Paul Blanchard, who is at PSE, and Doug Gollin, who is at Tufts. And it's on high frequency mobility in 3 African countries. Now, our understanding of mobility in low-income countries has been traditionally limited by lack of data. So on the one hand, we've been thinking about migration, and here we can think about either permanent migration or temporary or seasonal migration. And that type of data typically comes from either census data or standard microsurveys. If you think about the LSMS, they would have a migration module. The DHS, we have a little bit of information on how long people have been at their current residence. On the other end of the spectrum, we have data on commuting. And these typically come from commuting surveys. They're mostly not available in low-income countries. And here we would have a location of work and a home location. Typically, also, these won't collect information on kind of non-work trips. Now, there are newer sources, and I put here big data, that allow us to get more fine-grained measures of commuting and migration. And there's a set of papers that looks at migration and the role of networks or understanding commuting and the dispersion of economic activity. But we know little about mobility at other time scales in low-income countries. And so what we do in this paper is we try to study a type of mobility that's difficult to capture. And what we have in mind are visits. So these are movements of people from their home locations to other locations that are not necessarily for daily work. And these might allow individuals to benefit from visiting locations or consuming amenities without having to relocate. So without having to pay the fixed costs of relocation, they can do a visit to a certain location, consume the amenity, and then return. And so examples of this could be enjoying consumption goods that are unavailable elsewhere, managing administrative and legal matters, marketing goods and services without having to pay traders. And so we're fairly agnostic. Cities deliver or might deliver any of these amenities to people that visit them. And we're going to look in more detail later about what are the types of places we see people at. Now, this mobility is common and frequent. Anybody having spent time in an African country knows how busy these bus stops are. The bus stations, people come and go. And so this is kind of the image that we have in mind that we want to capture this. This is not daily commuting. It's also not migration moves. It's in-between mobility. So what do we do here? We use fine-grained anonymized data from smartphone applications, and I'll tell you in detail what these look like. Each ping represents an instance when the smartphone connects to the internet. We have more than 1 million devices over an entire year, and we can do this for Kenya, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And this allows us to provide new evidence on this type of high-frequency mobility for large numbers of people. And because these are continuous data, so every time we have the device connects to the internet, we have a ping that allows us to just look at any kind of temporal and spatial scale. So I think the paper kind of aims to make 3 contributions. The first is to think about a novel set of metrics. Since it's a type of mobility that traditionally we haven't captured, what is a good way of capturing high-frequency mobility with a set of parsimonious measures that think about the frequency, spatial extent, the densities visited, and the connectedness of locations. We use these measures to provide a rich description of mobility in these 3 countries. And then we write, so we can ask things like, how much long distance travel is there? what patterns of mobility are there across cities. So where do people go from depending on their home location? What type of cities do they visit? Do all go to the capital or do all go to the next bigger city? And we can ask how much connectivity is there between rural areas? Does this look like these rural areas are isolated, where people are not in contact with people from higher densities, or is there quite a high level of connectivity? And that will tell us something about how we should think about information frictions, and underline this as sort of also the variable cost of distance. And then we write down a model and test that characterizes the visits that we observe in the data, and that's more kind of a very stylized model, and that gives us some predictions that we can take to the data. So this is just a snapshot of the data. So you have Kenya, Nigeria, and Tanzania. These are visits to any city of more than 50,000 people. And you can see a couple of things already on these pictures. Sort of the brightness of the line corresponds to the number of visits. So you can see already that these cities draw in people from all around these countries. There are different geographies in these countries. So in Kenya, you can see that Nairobi really exerts a very strong pull. In Nigeria, there's a little bit more of a system of cities. But being the administrative capital, for example, doesn't determine which city has the most urban pull for these. So in Nigeria, well, here you have Lagos, and here you have Abuja. So this is the capital. Both of these have a sizable number of visits. In Tanzania, on the other hand, this is Dar es Salaam. And if you didn't know where the capital is, from this map, it would be very hard to tell. It's here, Dodoma. So what do we find? We find a substantial degree of mobility, large fractions of day from home, long distances traveled, and people visit several cities. The largest cities are magnets for people from all over the country. And the secondary cities appear to be substitutes. So people would not go across secondary cities. We don't see much travel between these two types of locations. And then we find strong networks of connectivities between places. So this really challenges the idea that rural areas are isolated. And then the mobility patterns are also consistent with the theoretical framework. So here we see visits from a smaller to a larger settlement are higher than vice versa. The fraction of days users spend away visiting a city follows a gravity equation. And then between two equidistant locations, users will visit a larger one. And we interpret this as evidence that these cities provide amenities that people can consume during these visits. So I'll just briefly say that we can relate, I think, broadly to three literatures. One is a methodological one that tries to bring new data to study phenomena that were previously hard to measure. The second is a large literature on quantitative spatial models. And then a third literature is the literature where Dag and I have a paper with David Lagakos as well, thinking about spatial gaps and differences in living standards across space. So I'll talk about the data and sample, mobility measures, the theory, the tests, and then I'll conclude. So each observation in our data is a ping. So it's an instance that a smartphone accesses the internet via a set of apps. So this could be social, Facebook, or whatever is the newer version of this, navigational, or it could be informational. We don't know which app a phone accesses at each instance, and we also don't know the set of apps. So we're very limited in the type of information, in the kind of additional information. What we do know is for each device, we have a device identifier, we have a timestamp, and we have a longitude and latitude. And so this is what the data looks like. So we have a user ID here, ID 1, 2, 3. Then we have these timestamps across time. And then we have a longitude and latitude. Now, a strength of these data is that they're very precise. So it's 5 to 10 meters. So you can imagine there's a difference. We will pick up whether I'm standing here or at another part of this building. So this is very precise. But that's it. There are no covariates that come with it. I don't know anything about demographics. And so this is very different.
Do you calculate the coverage in the sense of where they have access to internet? What do we know about having access to different places, and that we limit when you see them?
So that's a selection concerns that we don't know if they move when there is no coverage. Coverage fairly broad or has widened largely in these countries. So we've looked at maps. We don't have precise coverage maps, but kind of the data that's publicly available looks like there's very broad coverage here. One advantage of using ping data is that it's not limited to a particular operator. So if we used call data records that are linked to a specific mobile phone operator, there might be differences in coverage across certain areas of the country, whereas here, anytime a phone connects to the internet, we have a ping.
Another question about coverage. What fraction of the population possesses a smartphone?
I'll show you.
Okay.
So we start by assigning home locations, and that's very typical in this literature. We want to try to figure out where do people live. That allows us to compute mobility, but in the first instance, it allows us to think about selection, which I think we spent the first year and a half of this paper thinking about. So the typical way of doing this is to say, where do we observe a user most frequently at night? And so we take this modal 0.1 degree cell, so you can think about this as a cell of about 1 kilometer, where we see a user between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., and we call that a night the home location. We impose 2 additional restrictions. One, we see a user for more than 10 nights, and we see that user at the inferred home location for at least 50% of those nights. And so we do this to exclude users that we see at lots of different locations or very infrequently. We want to be able with some confidence to say this is where we think that user resides. We can run all the mobility metrics on the full sample, where we just say modal location at night, and it doesn't matter, but I think it's a cleaner way of measuring mobility. Now, there are irregularities in the data. I'm not sure whether you see those with the chairs. And this is just for somebody who wants to work with this, mislabeled locations. So for example, latitude, longitude being the same. So you see people kind of 45-degree line. Data sinks, we had users, lots of users in a location, tried to figure out where that was. It was somewhere in Dodoma. Turns out this is roughly, centroids vary a little bit depending on what method you use to compute centroids of polygons. Turns out probably is a centroid where the app didn't collect the precise information, but just put the people in the centroid of the country. So we remove those observations. Now, here are some statistics about these users. So for the 3 countries, we see them for about 100 days on average, and that's true for all countries. We see them on about 40 distinct days, and we have between 40 and 100 pings per day. Now, the same thing we do with home location, we do also with work location. And so here, what we see is about 80% of people work in the same square kilometer than they reside at home, which is not very surprising when you think about the kind of the type of employment that is prevalent in these contexts. So, selection. Now, smartphone app users are in no way representative of the population, and I think we're hopefully very clear in the paper that's not the way we think about it. What we do is to take 3 steps, given that we only have the pings, to think about and how we can measure what type of selection might be going on. So first, we match home locations with population density. That's also something that's very typical. This is to get a sense of just how users are distributed compared to the population. The second is we use the ICT Access and Usage Surveys to look at characteristics of users by device ownership. So these are surveys that collect information on the types of devices people have, and then some characteristics. And then third, we match home locations with DHS data, demographic and health survey data, to look at the characteristics of places. So we know where our users reside, we know the survey clusters of the DHS, and then we look at whether the DHS population in those clusters looks very different for clusters that we can match compared to those that we can't match. And these are nationally representative surveys. Now, it's not as straightforward because they're displaced as well, yeah, we have all the details in the paper on how we deal with this. Now, so far, I've kind of loosely equaled here device and users. Now, of course, there's no way to check that that is the case. People might be sharing devices. they might be using multiple devices or SIM cards. Now, multiple devices, given that these handsets are still fairly expensive, I think is less of a concern. Sharing devices might be. If we think people share a phone, for example, for travel, we would be overestimating mobility because we would think it's one user, whereas this might be a couple of people using that phone. But there is no way in a way that we can check this. There's, of course, turned off devices, coverage, like Paco mentioned. There are some differences between smartphone application data and CDR data that have been used in some of the previous work. We talk about that in the paper. Transit ping, some people might be using Google Maps or other software to travel. And we might have a lot of pings on the road, so we develop an algorithm that tries to remove those when the phone is moving. This matters mostly when I show you this, the transition matrices between different types of densities, because we'd want to understand whether there are connectivities between networks, but we don't want to pick up if somebody drives through a location. That's not a location visited in a sense that people interact with each other, exchange information. And then there are outliers. So we also remove some of the very high mobility people just to check that they're not driving the results. Okay, so these are the home locations in Nigeria. I'll show you these maps for Nigeria in the paper. We have them for the other countries, but the kind of takeaway messages are very similar. So on the left, these are our users. And the darker these pixels are, the more users we have. And on the right, this is world population density. So this is just one of the population density products is out there. So you can see that our users are roughly kind of distributed in according to population density, but also they are spread out through the country. So it's not, before starting this project, we did not know whether we would just see users in the capital and in a handful of big cities. So they seem to be spread out throughout the country. So the coverage is broadly national. If we look at the regional capitals, we have users in 112 of the 115 regional capitals in those three countries. And then the R-square between population users is between 0.43 and 0.62, with coefficients around 1 or a little bit higher. So this would be looking different. So these coefficients are very similar for other types of contexts where people have used, for example, CDR data. I'll show you a graph in 2 slides that would look different for had we done this in the US, for example. Now,
You can see where
we have in the
And that would
paper.
be, like, I guess, the on the lower density, that would be farther off.
I'll show you a histogram in a moment, and also we've looked at
Perfect.
So these are home locations within Lagos and population. So you see that also within cities we have coverage. Again, within city, we could worry that we only have people in the very rich areas or where the foreigners live, or it looks like there's coverage that's roughly in line with population density. Now, that's the graph. So here we look at where those users fall into by population density. So every bin here has 10% of the population. And so you can see this is a highly urban tilt of the sample. So 70% of users fall into the highest density bins.
they should 10%.
So if you were doing this in the US, exactly. It would be a flat
Between the
line.
10%.
And so if you were doing this in the US or people who have used these data, that would be very flat. Because there you can really think with these types of data, you have a population sample, or very close to population sample. Here, of course, is very different. Now these penetration rates are going up. So these data come from between 2016 and 18. I think the picture would also already look better if we were using the more recent data. Now, this is device ownership by location. So to the question of what do we know about penetration rates? So these are 4 types of devices, either none, a basic phone. Yesterday, somebody talked about the mobile phone. So the basic kind of Nokia that we had, kind of the first types of phones, the feature phones. You can think here about again, a Nokia with a color screen, and then a smartphone. And so I've split this up by rural and urban here. So you can see that urban penetration rates of smartphones are between 51% here, 23% in Nigeria, close to 30% in Tanzania. If we add up feature phones and smartphones, we have between 50 and 60% of coverage. Now, unsurprisingly, coverage is lower in rural areas. And this is already what we saw when we looked at distribution of home locations.
Sorry, something in favor of the pink data. Actually, it's not very clear whether the benchmark is the census, no? Because also the census cannot be that accurate. So maybe in this place, what you're capturing also is the difference between how updated the census is about where the people are and where actually people really are. So to me it can also be that the reason you are not finding this perfect shape is about the institution of the census itself.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, with the census data being typically collected every 5, mostly every 10 years, there's a big lag. And in some countries, we might not trust the census figures. I think it's still fair to say that we have a really urban sample here when we look at it. I appreciate the defense of it. But I think sort of when looking at where people are, even if there had been a good fraction moving to urban areas, we'd have an urban tilt. Now, so to wrap up selection, users are more urban, they're likely more educated and richer. So with the ICT access and usage surveys, or the data set that I just showed you on penetration rates, we can look at income distributions, education levels, we can look at device ownership by gender, and we see that users of smartphones are richer, they're more educated typically, but there's also quite a bit of overlap in those distributions for different types of device ownership. Smartphone owners represent a substantial fraction of the urban population, and the absence of this type of data and insights on mobility, given the absence on the entire populations, we argue that it's still worthwhile. It's a worthwhile population to still study. Okay, so how do we measure mobility? We're going to think about frequency, spatial extent, densities visited, and then cities visited. And we can think about incoming flows and outgoing flows to those places. So this is the fraction of days with mobility beyond 10 kilometers. And you can see that fraction is substantial. So it's between 12 and 15% of days people are seen more than 10 kilometers away from their home locations. This is the distribution of these distances, or the fraction of days. And we can also look at that by population density, and we see that people in the lower densities are the ones that are more mobile. Now, this is the average distance at home for non-home ping, so it's a measure of how far people go. And you can see that's substantial too, between 32 kilometers in Tanzania and 46 kilometers in Nigeria. So people travel substantial distances. Now, this is a it's a spatial transition matrix. So what you see here on the horizontal line here is the home density bin, and then the visited density bin. And so the numbers represent the fraction of individuals living in the home density bin that are anytime seen during the period of the year in the visited density bin. So for example, 1.5% of those living in the highest density bin are ever seen in the lowest density bin. 3.2% in the highest density bin are seen in the second lowest density bin, and so forth. So you see that there are connectivities between the highest people residing in the highest density decile and the lowest density. And these numbers are much higher when we look in the other direction. So 42% of those who live in the lowest density bin are seen during the course of the year in the highest density bin. And this is sort of, I think, consistent with the patterns that we see in developed countries too, where the typical New Yorker is probably going to stay in New York, and then people from outside are going to come to visit New York City.
Oh.
Yeah.
If you were to do this in terms of cheap way controlling by the fact that in the lowest density you have, say, the top 1 percentile of I can see, I can look at the top density bin. I will take the artificially the highest percentile of movement, consistent with the fact that in the lowest density bin I only have the 1% of the population. And redo this, scaling things up appropriately and assuming some rankings that the guys that I observe in the lowest density bins are the more mobile. And I look at the most mobile in the high density bin, just to make it more comparable. To make it more comparable in a particular artificial way. In the lowest density bin, I only observe the 1% of the population, or well, 10% of the one that I should be observing. And those, let's assume that those are gonna be observing the richest guys, say, for the sake of the argument, they happen to be more mobile. While in the top density bin, I've observed more people, and because I observe more people, I'm not observing the ones that are more mobile in my artificial story. And when I make the mobility, it's not clear because I'm not sure how to do it exactly, and we have some assumptions on the ranking of the one I observe and how they come.
I understand your point.
I
Yeah.
don't-
So
It's
so,
sort of a suggestion. I don't know
Yeah.
how to do it exactly.
yeah, no, I think we can, it's quite straightforward to implement. I mean, I get your point where you said that 1% is an average between a few high mobility people and a lot of urban non-mobility people. Yeah. Whereas here we sample from a different population. We only have the high mobility. Yeah, we could do that. I mean, here the idea is really how much connectivity is there between locations? How often does a rural person go to the densest area or somebody from a rural area? And we don't need everybody to go there, for there's to be some information flows. Yeah.
Somewhat related. Could you use the transit pings in order to infer about the duration of the travel? Because then you could, for example, inspect the density of durations to see whether some people use modes of transport that are faster, others they walk. I mean, distance is interesting, but I mean, perhaps it would be even more interesting to see how long does it take people to get from A to B.
We can. And so I'm glad you bring this up. Transit pings are actually something that we can exclude here. So here we'd be worried if the transit pings are driving the results. And thinking about how long it takes, that's something we're thinking about doing now because it tells us something about the cost in terms of time. Yeah, we can do that. Okay, looking at cities, visitors outside city boundaries, you can see here for Lagos, for example, there's a significant fraction coming from Abuja and vice versa. Now you look at these secondary cities, Ibadan and Kaduna, you see that small fractions come from, or Kano and Kaduna, let's say Kano and Kaduna, come from, they're not too far from each other, but we have 11% visitors to Kano come from Kaduna and vice versa, that number is about 10%. So people are really pulled into these high density areas, but they're modest flows between secondary cities. This is to show you that people make multiple visits over the year, and they also visit more than one city on average. Okay, where do people go? So this is just a plot to show you the visited locations in Lagos over the entire period. I'm plotting government buildings, markets, and then the red dots are the pink. So you can see that people are really, it's not like they just visit a few locations. Where do they go when they visit? So we can zoom in further and we can look at certain areas within the city where we see pings. So for example, this is a shopping area. This is the casino here. The airport, you see the airport building on the runways, close to the gates. This is a stadium. This is the Indian embassy. And you can see people walking around and then entering the building. And this is the hospital. And so there are various types of locations that people are seen at. Can we quantify this in a way? So what we do here is we overlay OpenStreetMap polygons and then look at where do we see people to get a sense of what are the types of amenities that people visit in those different types of locations. Of course, we never know the intent, but we can say something about the locations that we see users at. So we do this for visitors. Given that we know their home location or their inferred home location, we can also look at visitors, for example, from below 300 people per square kilometer, which is sort of the threshold that the global human settlements layer uses to delineate urban areas. Visitors from above, we have much lower numbers of visitors, the lowest density areas, and then residents. And you can see they're seen at a range of locations. Residents are seen at more locations, but we also see them over the entire year, so that is not surprising. And this table shows you the 6 kind of key cities in those places: Lagos, Abuja, Nairobi, Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, and Dodoma. Now, to what extent is this driven by the availability of amenities, and to what extent does that vary across deciles of city size? So this is for Nigeria, and you can see that it requires a certain level of city size to have certain amenities. So for example, airports only really pick up after decile 6 here of city size, and then tertiary health facilities and universities, it's the same. We can look where we see people depending on, so we do this for all of Nigeria now. And you can see residential fraction is fairly constant, and the other types of places that we see people really pick up after a certain level of density. And this is for the other types of locations. Again, road is very constant, and then the other ones. Now, of course, coverage varies across those places, and using these OpenStreetMap polygons is not, there are measurement issues there, but this is what we can do. Okay, so we see people away from home on a 6th and a 10th of the days. Residents from more sparsely populated areas are more frequently away from home than city center residents. Across all densities, a sizable fraction visits a number of non-home cities, and they do this on multiple occasions. Cities are magnets for travelers across those countries. Secondary cities are substitutes, and visitors are seen at a range of locations when they make those visits. So let me tell you about the theory. I have 10 minutes, so let's talk about this. So what we do here is we consider a model where individuals make mobility choices optimally, and they have to decide on which destinations to visit, how frequently they do this, and what's the duration for each of those visits. So we have our economy is a set of locations. A grid cell is X, and a person has a home location that's H, and that's part of X. Individuals have preferences of an agricultural good AI, a non-agricultural good CI, and an amenity good QI. And I'll tell you about how that is produced and how they can consume that. Now, preferences are represented by this utility function, and there's some idiosyncratic preference over the home location. So they can consume amenities that are produced in different locations. And to consume the amenity, they have to go and visit. And the quantity depends on how long they stay and the quantity of amenities that a location produces. So theta IX is the fraction of time an individual spends during a visit to location X. And we assume that location X produces Y of X. And so then QI, so the quantity of the amenity that I consumes in X is theta IX times Y of X. We assume this is a non-rival amenity. So visits have a minimum duration. You can think of this as a day, for example. So there'll be a discrete number of visits, and VIX is the number of visits that person I makes to location X. Amenities aggregates, and there's some preference for variety. Now the cost of visits. So we assume 3 types of costs. There's a fixed cost of making a trip. So you can think that's packing your bag. There's a cost per unit of distance traveled from the home location. So you can think of this as the bus ticket that scales with distance. And then there's a cost that's associated with time spent in the location. And we're assuming that increases with the duration of the visit. So if you go for a shorter period, you might crash on somebody's couch. Whereas if you go for longer, you have to make some alternative arrangements. that's the budget constraints. Individuals supply 1 unit of labor and receive a wage. So that part is very simple. Wages and prices of both goods can be location specific. Amenities are free to consume, but travel is costly. And so that's the budget constraint. So individuals have to choose the quantity of the consumption goods, AI and CI, the number and duration of visits to each location, and they maximize utility subject to the budget constraint. So a note on geography, N is the population that lives in a location X, and we say that the location is populous if it's above a certain threshold. And then we say that a settlement is a subset of populous locations that has spatially contiguous locations. So they're adjacent to each other. And each location in X is populous. And then total population exceeds this threshold value. And so that's not too different from how some of the newer products think about measuring the extent of city sizes in terms of contiguous pixels. Now we can order kind of these settlements by size and assume that NK upper bar is the largest one. Production is very simple. So location, we assume that amenities are produced, are increasing in the population in a location. So it's just this expression here, and there is increasing returns. We assume that a rural location produces an identical amenity, but is lower than the smallest settlement. So people have no incentive to go there. And then production of goods is simple. Agricultural goods are only produced in the rural areas. Consumption goods are only produced in settlements. Both goods are traded frictionlessly, prices determined exogenously, so that there is nothing interesting going on there. So we consider a short-run equilibrium without migration. We assume the marginal value product of a worker in non-agriculture is higher, which I think sort of in line with the literature than in agriculture. Real income will be higher in urban areas and in rural areas. And these spatial gaps are sustained by differences in location-specific preferences and mobility frictions. And then there's optimization with regard to the number, duration, and destination of visits. So we get 3 kind of propositions out of the model that I will take to the data. And I will actually, I have them on the slides, so I will show them directly to you when I show you the results. So the first proposition says that the number of visits from a smaller to a larger settlement will be higher than vice versa. And we can look at this in the data, and we see that this is actually what we find. So this is the number of visits per person from the smaller to the larger has to be higher than the number of visits, vice versa. And we see that the data is consistent with this. Now, we also get the duration of visits follows this gravity equation. And so these are the fraction of days a user from O spends in D is a function of the distance and then a set of origin and destination fixed effects. And so we can estimate this directly off the data. And so these are the negative distance coefficients, which is sort of in line with the more standard gravity equations. And here this always controls for origins and destination fixed effects. We can also use travel time instead of just distance. Now, partially why we do this is the model predicts holding distance constant, individuals are more likely to visit a more populous destination and stay longer because of the way amenities are produced. Now, we can test this. So we extract the destination fixed effects, compare these to city size, and I always use the smallest city as the omitted category. And so you can see these are the destination fixed effects from the gravity equation plotted against log city size. You can see a couple of things. These biggest cities are out there. So they're really much higher in both the city fixed effect and city size than the other cities. But you also see interesting features about the geography of these countries. So when we looked at the map for Tanzania, for example, we saw fewer visits to Dodoma than we would have maybe predicted, given that it's the capital of the city. And we see this here. So the city fixed effect is much higher for Dodoma. So it gets more visitors than its size will predict. And we see this for Abuja as well, here in Nigeria. And then on the other hand, we see things like Zanzibar here that gets many fewer visitors than it should given its size. But that is also, that makes a lot of sense given that there's a body of water between Zanzibar and the mainland. So there are some spatial frictions here that lower the number of visits. So in a way, this is reassuring that these results pick up some of the real physical geographies of these locations. And then this is just in regression format. So there's a strong relationships and these outliers, as you saw, they have disproportionately high destination fixed effects. Okay, so what we find is a striking degree of mobility. So flows are large, people are spending large number of days away from home. Cities are magnets for mobility originating from everywhere. Secondary cities are substitutes to each other. The biggest cities attract visitors from all over the country. This challenges the idea that these locations are isolated. And the mobility patterns are also consistent with the theoretical framework that I just showed you. Now, where does this leave us? So there's a previous literature, although that's contested too, that there are large spatial and sectoral gaps. Now, if this is true, that should lead to strong upward pressure on mobility across locations, so pressure for people to relocate. An alternative view of those gaps is that visits offer an alternative technology to migration. So it's almost like a rental market for lumpy purchases of equipment. This allows people to benefit from urban locations without having to incur the large fixed costs of relocating. And so an implication of this, so you can think about this as sort of partial urbanization. And an implication of this is that cities are benefiting individuals beyond their own residence by allowing them to visit them. Okay, thanks very much. Okay.
So I think we can continue to the next presentation maybe and postpone discussion to the coffee break. So thanks, Martina, Trinity College Dublin, and CEPR. And now we're going to have Francisco Buera from Washington University St. Louis, NBER, and CEPR. Please, Paco.
Thank you for including this paper. It's been a great conference so far, and it's a great location. This is work with Nico Tracher. Let me just give you a big picture introduction, then jump into what we're doing. This is a paper macro development, so that's one way to think of economic development is about the process of adoption of modern complementary technologies. One view, the natural view of the lack of development is the idea that there are frictions to that process. And those frictions might or might not be more relevant for some sectors, but there's a long-standing view that you can trace that to Hirschman, that economic development requires an unbalanced approach. But by unbalanced, Hirschman means the fact that you may need to focus on some sectors as opposed to others. There's been a rich and a very interesting recent literature that have studied the role of networks and how frictions percolate through input-output networks. We're going to follow this literature. This literature has stressed the relevance of sectoral distortion and has kind of analyzed makes steps in thinking about how policies should be directed through these networks. One limitation of this literature is taking the technology structure as given. So one question that we're going to ask, going back to the perspective and development that we set up at the beginning, is how we should think about policies to foster economic development. That would mean to foster technology adoption. So that would be a way to think about it. Which sector should we focus on, at least to a first order? And which policy instruments, something that haven't been kind of analyzed in the previous literature. That's what we're going to try to do today. Let me be more specific. When I study technology adoption, multi-sector economy with complementarities, we're going to be building on some earlier work with Hugo that we have with Hugo and Jones. The key ingredients of the theory will be technology adoption decision, will be distortions limiting the extent which that is efficient. And we're going to have a rich IO structure. That will be one difference from our earlier work. We're going to use data to estimate the distribution of technologies and the parameter of the model. So the model will be amended, the previous model will be amended to have a little more richness that will make this estimation exercise more natural. I'm going to use the model as a laboratory for industrial policies. And in particular, we're going to look at a local analysis. So the previous paper were stressing the nonlinearities. Today, we're going to have a focus on smaller steps. We're going to try to understand which sectors are going to be more important to a first order and which policy instruments we're going to do. And we're going to, all that will be encoded in this, we're going to call sectoral development multipliers. I will tell you a little bit a ranking of sectors and how much you get from focusing on some sector versus other.
Paco, is there any sense of comparative advantage of a country? It's something that, you know, that as part of the primitive, the economy, one economy may have a comparative advantage in one of the sectors. Other countries may have a different comparative advantage, and how this might guide or move away these industrial policies.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit at the conclusions. Not today. Today it will be a closed economy. So.
Oh, it's a closed economy. Okay.
But one natural extension that we're kind of starting to work on will be that we can talk about how that will matter or not.
So technology adoption is essentially internal IID. So there is no adoption from foreign technologies?
No, it just maybe foreign technologies, but you're not going to be, the economy will not be open to trade. And that might go and just reviewing some conjectures that we have, not today. So is that a lot of the complementarities and the percolation will go through prices, open economy, and they might limit those price effects. So it might be relevant, but I don't know. But it's not exactly what you're asking, but as I mentioned, which that will affect
my innocent mind, when you hear the word industrial policy, there's trade. It seems to be a big component of how we are going to distort or move the natural tendency of a country in laissez-faire versus.
So that's an interesting extension that we're already working on, but not gonna be saying much today. So it's a large literature that already mentioned the first two items. It's a growing literature on quantifying models of complementarities in development. So I recommend all of them that we are not involved on. So that it's an exciting area of research. And they're going to be, we're going to think about technology adoption, think of technologies as kind of capital embedded. So there's going to be a literature investment networks that we're going to be touching upon. Okay, so what I'm going to do today will be spend a bit of time discussing the theory. We'll be going over very briefly about the calibration estimation of the model. It's a part of the paper we're very proud of, but it's not going to have a lot of time. And then we're going to look at the quantitative answers. We're going to go through what we're going to refer to as sectoral revenue multiplier. We're going to focus first on policies that correspond to as subsidy to the revenues of a sectors. And they're going to finish by going through alternative policy instruments. Alternative policy instruments are going to be thinking of maybe subsidizing the revenues of a sector, of taxing the revenues of a sector, or alternatively, one instrument that will be very powerful in the estimated model will be an adoption subsidy. I'm going to discuss, compare the two. And the next steps I may answer again to Alex, but in a very conjectural way. Okay, let me go through the model. So these slides will have the model. So let me go into details, and then I'm going to jump into characterizing it. There's going to be an economy. There will be a CS consumption aggregate that will give us kind of welfare in some sense. There will be a Koch-Douglas with sectoral coefficients gamma S. They're going to stack them up into a vector gamma, capital gamma. Each of those sectors will be the output of each of those sectors. You can think of an aggregate of the outputs of differentiated products that will be combined into a CS aggregate with a CS substitution eta. Eta will be an important parameter, so tell you how complementary the outputs of different firms happen to be. There will be firm heterogeneity, both ex ante and ex post. Ex ante will be Pareto with a tail coefficient zeta. Ex post will be log normal. For the most part, you can ignore the ex post heterogeneity, other than when you want to look at this, do the estimation, that will be useful to kind of relate better with the size distribution of firms in the data. But the way we're going to introduce it will be kind of a multiplicative constant in all the equations. So you can ignore, unless I want to discuss estimation. I'm not going to do it that much. So and it knows ex ante before making the adoption or entry decisions. And then after
additional nodes.
After the adoption and entry decisions, we'll have additional nodes that will be able to act upon in choosing the variable factors. So when you think of the size distribution of firms, will be affected by these two heterogeneities. And will useful in smoothing out some bimodal distribution implications. That's kind of what they roll. But when you feed the microdata, that will be useful. Okay, so then that's kind of heterogeneity. Firms, so the product will be produced using labor intermediate inputs. We're going to refer to with a sort of so-called a rich IO structure. In particular, we're going to have intermediate input aggregate of each sector. Will be using intermediate input from all other sectors. I'm going to combine in a Koch-Douglas fashion. And it will be a matrix omega that will be telling you what is the factor share or factor elasticity for sector S of inputs used from all other sector S prime or the reverse. I never remember how we do it. Then that's kind of and the production of each individual product can be done with two technologies: the traditional and a modern technology. Traditional technology has some productivity AT, some cost of adoption. We're going to think if in labor only units kappa TS. There will be a modern technology that will presumably have a larger productivity. Will have to pay a cost of adoption in labor units as the traditional, plus a good cost of extra good cost of adoption, kappa M, with a price that will be sector specific. And this cost of adoption will be the adoption goods. Think of this. Think about this embedded in capital that will be produced with a separate input output network. You can think of what oftentimes referred to as the capital flow data in the national income and products accounts. And then another parameter will be important is nu will be the share of intermediate input in the production of an individual good. So that's sort of the structure. In terms of policy, we're going to think about potentially a revenue subsidy. Most of the discussion will be in terms of a revenue subsidy. R, there will be a vector that might vary by sector. But you can think of a labor subsidy, labor input subsidy, intermediate input subsidy, and or adoption subsidy. And one sort of comment on the key inefficiency in the model. So this is it will be in the second bullet. There will be monopolistic competitive structure. So there will be a markup. Firm will be charged a markup on over the marginal cost that will relate it to the elasticity substitution era. So that will be, if you want, the key inefficiency that will give a role to policy. And this will be, by construction, will be a distortion that will be uniform across sectors. What is the interesting aspect of that, I guess, the first order policy effects will be very heterogeneous. Even though you want to implement the first best, you want to do a uniform subset. You want to do a large policy, the optimal policy will be uniform. So that's something I want to highlight from the beginning.
In principle, you could have a structure with instead of being uniform across sectors, that you could have
heterogeneous
sector or heterogeneous.
Yeah.
In that case, you will have
even in the optimal policy. But what kind of I want to stress is the heterogeneous implications for small policies, even in the uniform case.
Maybe I missed what you just asked, but could you you have to have either eta or gamma fixed across sectors, right? For like identification purposes when you do this. You can't have it both heterogeneous.
In principle, it depends on which data you're using.
Okay.
For today, we're gonna calibrate data directly.
Okay, I see.
So, but there's a literature on estimating substitution by sector or not. So broader Weinstein or not. You can imagine doing these things much more general. We're not.
Okay.
So, but there's a world out there that might tell you something about that we're not gonna do. So that's what we're gonna be doing today. Okay, so let me just go a little bit quickly through a little bit of the characterization of the model. Let me just discuss briefly the key margin they're going to be focusing on will be entry and but mostly technology adoption. But let me describe that. Let me look at introduce the operating profits of an intermediate input producing in sector S. Will be this pi O IS function that depends on the technology used. And you will come from the maximization of profit, choosing by prices and intermediate input subject to satisfying some demand. Given this, gonna be two key marginal conditions. One will be the marginal entry condition. You can think of the adoption of the condition for the adoption of traditional technology, but also the margin. To the extent that the marginal entrant is traditional, we're given by this condition. I tell you that operating profit should be equal. The expected operating profit should be equal to the entry cost kappa T, or the cost of implemented traditional technology kappa T. And you can, this expectation over epsilon is gonna happen to give you multiplicative constants that you have to incorporate. And then there will be a key condition that we're going to be focusing on will be the adoption condition that tells you that the gain from adoption, the different operating profits from using the traditional versus the modern technology should be equal to the cost of adoption. And that's where, and this also from here, it's going to be also be useful to describe where policy will enter. We're going to think of a revenue subsidy that will be multiply the revenues of the firms. Intermediate input subsidy will be affecting the cost of inputs of the firms, and adoption subsidy will affect the cost of adoption of the firm. Okay, so given the structures, they're going to be price indices. They're going to be stuck into vectors, the price of the sector, the good of the sectors, the price of the intermediate input that the sector uses, and the price of the adoption good PM. And an object they're going to be using a lot will be the fraction of adopters and the fraction of entrant in the sectors are going to be given by these expressions, given the threshold for the marginal entrant and the marginal adopters. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
And this may seem ignorant, but you have CES production aggregators by sector that are constant. You have heterogeneity and productivity.
Mm-hmm.
Where absent the subsidies, everything's first best, right?
I know absent the markup, the markup distortions. The
Yeah, I
markup
guess I'm
distorts.
thinking in like the Dinger and Morrow context, when you have, even if you have heterogeneous productivities, and as long as you have a CES aggregator that everyone shares the same elasticity parameter in that, you should have first best. I mean, maybe
No, that would be the case if you have
one sector.
no, what break the efficiency will be the fact you have intermediate input use.
Oh, okay.
So that margin, so it's true. Forget about intermediate input, then that's true because we have fixed labor supply. So you can have inefficient with endogenous labor supply that we don't have, so that's not a margin. But you can have inefficiency because you have this intermediate input usage.
Okay.
So that the condition, how much labor and intermediate input each firm uses is distorted by the markup, and that leads to an aggregate inefficiency. And then even if you have not, also you can think of with the adoption in goods units or in investment goods units, so to speak, that also give you a margin that the adoption decision is inefficient. So even if you don't have intermediate input in production, the fact that this is in the price of the adoption goods distorted, that will also.
Okay. I see.
Yeah. Okay, so what is going to be the given policies? Asymmetric equilibrium consists of thresholds for each sector, demand for labor and intermediate input and aggregate demand, and prices such that good markets clear, labor market clears, and that will give you that will what you're gonna get. That will be, and that's what an equilibrium will be. So we're gonna do next is I'm gonna try to characterize locally the impact on equilibrium allocations of changes in policies. And to do that, let me define a few things. I guess this will be kind of intermediate steps. Let me define an aggregate productivity index, capital Z, that will be a geometric weighted average of the productivity of firms in a sector, and there will be firms that use the traditional technology and firms that use the modern technology, and you can derive an aggregate production function for the sector. That would be in terms of this aggregate productivity index. Related, you can think of the price of the sector will be a function of these productivity indexes and a function of policies. And is in any production network paper, there will be a Leontief inverse popping up. So that's kind of the sort of, if you're familiar with the literature, that's standard. If not, that's sort of very natural that the price the price of the good of a sector will be related to the productivity of this sector and all other sectors. And you're going to have this kind of infinite recursion that will give you the full effect of productivity in sectors and policies on the price of the sector. Say the f of z would be a Pareto would be z to the minus.
No normal exposure.
No, there is normal exposed shocks, and those are yeah, there are those by conveniently chosen units so that they have mean zero.
Okay,
but there
you enter, and even if you have a bad shock, you stay.
Yeah, because that's exposed.
Is it problem?
Yeah.
Okay, there is no way out. Once you decide to
so it's sort of
a good
it's sort of
realization, you enter, then you have a lousy screw it. You have to.
Yeah, so it's not. There's no. You can think of having richer dynamics and then there will be some further action. Okay, so that's it. And then you can get we're going to be using a lot. There's going to be a relationship between aggregate productivity and the adoption. The decision in the sector are going to be encoding this A, that is the share of adopters, or the measure of adopters in a sector, and you can work out the effect of adoption on productivity, and that will depend on a combination of parameter values will depend on a parameter we're going to label beta that will have the encode the role of complementarities will have it will be a function of eta and the heterogeneity in on productivity. That's something that we stress a lot, discuss a lot in the earlier papers, and try to gloss over and depends on the gain from technology adoption, the different productivity of the two technologies, and also depends on the share of the modern technologies matrix M. So that's this would be something that would be showing up all through the analysis. So this will be encoding the fact that more adoption lead to higher productivity, and there's going to be and that will percolate through the system by leading to lower prices on intermediate inputs that will show up over here. That might will result in more adoption. So that will be the key complementarity that we're going to endogenizing adoption will bring to the table. Okay, so the object that we'll try to we're going to study to be specific will be this one here. We're going to call a development multiplier that will level epsilon RS that will denote the sector. So will be given by the elasticity of welfare with respect to the policy. That would be this term here relative to a fiscal cost. So you think about how much welfare you're going to get per dollar invest in the policy. So you can think of giving you the first order impact of changing the policy, and embedded what we're having in mind that there will be some fixed amount of resources you have access to. So you may want to direct the policy in a cost-efficient way, in the sense of using each dollar of fiscal revenue to get the higher returns, and that will be a local measure of that. And in doing this, you can think this kind of follows earnest use analysis directly. Let's see. When I go next, is gonna try to characterize this, and we do that in two terms. I'm gonna first characterize the subsidy elasticity, the first term, and then it will be easy to know the fiscal cost. So can we first give you a characterization of the subsidy elasticity in terms of two effects? It will be when I think of one effect is going to be the direct effects of subsidies on welfare, holding fixed the productivity of the sectors, holding fixed adoption. And that's what you and the earlier literature have studied very closely. So Bakke and Fari, you can think of giving you a characterization of this. But also Ernest, you would be a particular characterization of these two. And here there will be a role for policies, and the role for the effect of policies will be given by the simple expression of the difference between these two vectors, psi, tilde, and psi. They're going to be the easiest one to think about. This is the second one. Psi will give me the one here. This will be what is referred to as the Dolmar weight. I guess we like to use the jargon backward Dolmar weight, and that's the one that you measure in the data directly. So what is the gross output share of a sector, and that encodes the cost of production of goods from the sectors. So it's backward in the sense that can incorporate the fact that the sector uses as inputs goods from other sectors, and you do that percolation backward and give you the sense of using the direct and indirect labor use by all sectors supplying to a particular sector is. And then there's another term is going to be the psi tilde. They sort of it's a forward Dolmar weight, and that's kind of calculate the impact of affecting the cost of production of a sector on all other sectors that will be using the goods from these sectors as input, and the sectors that will use the input of those sectors as inputs, so on and so forth. And that's going to be, can have the same, kind of the same structure, but this one here will feature less distortions, because it had to do with the fact that the price indices are kind of multiplicative in distortions. And the fact that in a distorted economy, these two will be different, and there will be the difference will be the effect of policies. And now we're gonna, the more interesting part is the second term. We're gonna label the TFP channel, is the fact that as you policy will change the adoption in different sectors, and for now we're gonna encode that into a change in the vector of productivity, and that by itself will change the cost and so on and so forth of other sectors, and will give you we have an effect. This will be very similar to this term here, with the difference that now we're gonna have an added distortion eta minus 1 over eta that has to do with the fact that the cost of generating a given change in productivity and the effects on welfare are different, and that has to do with the fact that firms are not firms are not able to profit don't capture all the welfare. So in some sense, the cost per unit of adoption is given by the profit of the marginal adopter that are smaller than the surplus, and this is this extra wedge that makes this term typically bigger than this term here. So that's a detail I'm not gonna spend that much too. In the paper we have an intuition for that. But when I spend more time now, it's gonna kind of looking at this term here. So by how much policy change the productivity of a sector. And to do that, I need to understand how policy affects adoption. So we're gonna refer to as what is the subsidy elasticity of adoption. If I change policy by a given amount, by how much do I change adoption? And now we already know how adoption affects productivity. So that's kind of the last term of this puzzle. And for doing that, what I'm gonna do is gonna log differentiate the condition of the marginal adopter, and that's gonna give me a relationship between how adoption is impacted by changes in policies. And they're gonna be a direct impact, and they're gonna be their indirect impact, because adoption are gonna affect the price of the intermediate the adoption good, gonna affect the revenue of the sectors, and it's gonna affect productivity. So when you put all this together, you're gonna get the following expression for the elasticity of adoption with respect to the policy. In this case, I'm gonna be thinking about, just for simplicity, first about the adoption policy, and then the effects of adoption revenue will be kind of a simple function of this. Yeah.
Sorry, Paco, could you remind me how the policy works? What is the policy?
We're thinking about 4 policies. For the most part here, this was up to now, I was thinking of the revenue subsidy.
Okay.
But you're also going to think of adoption subsidies. The revenue subsidy is going to pay firms in a sector some subsidy per unit of revenue. Adoption subsidy will be lower in the cost of adoption, and happen to be that is convenient for thinking about the effect of policy on adoption to think first on an adoption subsidy. And then a revenue subsidy will be this plus another one. So for this one here, I'm gonna be changing things on you a little bit by moving from revenue subsidy for one side to adoption subsidy. The adoption subsidy is I lower your cost of adoption goods by a given percent. So when I kind of show you here, this is gonna be a full expression. So this term here is the direct effect if prices were held fixed and productivity were held fixed. And this one here, we're gonna be an amplification term. That's just to we kind of related to a typical model of IO structure will be a Leontief inverse. What's sort of interesting here, they're going to have this double Leontief inverse at play. You can think of there being an inner Leontief inverse and an outer one. The inner one has to do with the fact that adoption raises TFP, the lowest prices of sector prices, and that's the cost of adoption. That's the first term here. And then there's an outer term that had to do because adoption raises TFP, that lowers the marginal cost of production in other sectors, fostering more adoption in other sectors, and that one give you another change of lowering the price of adoption and so on and so forth. So they're going to have these two, this term here will be key at have played a key role in understanding why when you have technology adoption, you're going to get an amplification on the effects of policies. There's going to be an early literature that has to study that there'll be the sectoral policy may have differential effects. Now, through this adoption channel, you're going to have these differential effects will be magnified, and then through the position of sectors, this input, output, and the production and adoption network might be even change the ranking.
Marco, another question.
Yeah.
And then this, then probably these expressions will be equilibrium dependent. If there is multiple equilibrium, there will be one set higher for one equilibrium.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. The earlier paper that was kind of simple, having this complex input output network, paid quite a lot of time in characterizing the set of equilibrium when there are multiplicity or not. So the answer is yes, it could be. From that paper, we learned that in what we found to be the more reasonable calibration, multiplicity was not featured. So we took that as a justification for now not focusing on that. On the other hand, we have been in this multi-sector version, we have been impossible to do that analysis in a feasible way. So then we hope that we have we have some peace of mind that it was not relevant there, and we hope that it's still not relevant here because now we're not going to be able to say that. Say more. Plus, now we're going to look at a local.
How the local analysis was meant to say that it's not that the policies are so large that you can switch from one equilibrium.
No, just local analysis just to have just a direction of it.
Okay.
The other thing that's also reassuring is that the identification that we have, we are able to identify whatever equilibrium is at play. There might be multiple equilibrium. We have a point identification that is robust to multiplicity in a sense. We don't have issues with there's an IO literature on multiplicity and not how to estimate those models. That's not going to be relevant for here. So you're going to identify one equilibrium, whatever is happening. If they were to be multiple, I'm going to have the local analysis of that equilibrium. Yeah. Okay. So in the paper, we're going to, let me see, how much time do you have? Okay, so in the paper, we go through some simple cases. Cases are going to be oftentimes useful to work with, will be cases of uniform policies. And those are going to be useful to work with because in case of uniform policy, you're going to get simple cross-form solutions for the expressions. So this would be an example of that. And here you're going to see the aggregate, the adoption elasticity in the case of a uniform policy. You're going to see the two Leontief inverse will be one of these terms here and one of the outer terms. So that's kind of an example and how different parameter values affect those inverse. So let me put all this together. So now what I have here is, now this is the full elasticity of aggregate consumption or welfare you want with respect to the policy. So for the case of a revenue subsidy, you're going to have these two terms. We're going to have the full production efficiency term that we discussed before, and then you're going to have the TFP, what you refer to as the TFP channel, that you will correspond to this term plus the term I showed you before. That now it's kind of stuck in a matrix fashion, and now you're going to do this for a revenue subsidy. And what will you get from an adoption subsidy? When you do an adoption subsidy, you don't have a productivity efficient effect, because adoption subsidy doesn't affect the use of the relative revenues of the different sectors, have only an effect through the adoption channel. So in principle, a revenue subsidy could give you a larger impact because it have a direct effect on production efficiency and an effect through the adoption margin, where an adoption subsidy has only an effect through adoption. And you can, I guess, you can just read it to the previous literature. In the previous literature, there's kind of this notion of influencing production that is developed by Vasco and Daron and co-authors, that has this what matters for an effect of TFP on aggregate output. In this case, you can think of there's going to be any influence on adoption that has to do with this term here. You can think of that as the effect on welfare of a change in the productivity of the adoption sector. And then finally, to finish this, to go from the subsidy of the elasticity of consumption to what we refer to the measure multipliers, we need to divide this term here by the fiscal cost of the policy, and the fiscal cost of the policies are in this last line. So for the case of a revenue subsidy, the fiscal cost of the policy is given by the dollar weights. You invest one, you want to subsidize with $1 to a particular sector, the total revenue that you need to be associated with that is going to be given by the dollar weight of the sector. A revenue, an intermediate input subsidy will have a fiscal cost of eta times that, so the factor share times their dollar weight. Similarly for the labor subsidy, an adoption subsidy, we have a fiscal cost equal to the share of the adoption good in aggregate output. And that's something you can show that is going to be strictly less than the dollar weight. So it's the same thing with adoption subsidies will be attractive because they're going to be relatively cheap than the revenue subsidy.
In the background, this is collected to the tax sector, household.
That we can, yeah, so think of the way we should be implementing this in the background is with lump sum taxes. So then that's kind of, given that is, looking at the fiscal cost doesn't seem to be that relevant. So we were thinking of, well, presumably this is a shadow cost of those resources. And then you may want to, that we are not modeling it. So for today, there's a sense in which by looking at elasticity should be enough, because if there are lump sum taxes, I shouldn't care. I should get a largest impact on output. So the logic of normalizing the fiscal cost is, well, we are not exactly modeling, but there's this distortionary cost of taxation, and that's going to be a cheap way, poorest man way to getting at that. Okay, so then an interesting question is, which one will be better, whether revenue subsidy and adoption subsidy? And it's a tricky question because here you see that a revenue subsidy gives you effects to margins. So potentially that could be stacking things for a revenue subsidy. On the other hand, adoption subsidy is going to be cheaper. So it's a quantitative question, which of them will matter, will be more relevant. Will end up being that the revenue subsidy, the adoption subsidy will be much more powerful. That's something that will happen later. So let me go through, so let me mostly tell you about how we do the estimation and not showing you that. But the idea, we're going to use data from India. We use a few set of data. We use data from the economic census to get information on the distribution of firm by sector on India. We use data on input-output from India too. And then we use the data on investment network. That one, we don't have it for India. We use it for the US from Bonlem and Winbury. And the hope is that since that the US data on investment network should be informative about the production structure of modern technologies. That's kind of what we'll be doing. We're going to use a GMM estimation for backing up a reduced form approach to back up the distribution of technologies and the parameters on the distribution of heterogeneity and the gain from adoption of modern traditional. And then we calibrate the structure, the production and investment structure, including the value of eta and intermediate input share. And then you do a full structural calibration of the full model to get go from reduced form estimates to a structural estimate, mostly to get production adoption and entry cost. So we get from the microdata some adoption thresholds, and then to back up the underlying adoption cost, we need to use the structure of the model to map the two. So that's what is done in the paper. And so let me give you the quantitative answers first, and if I have time, I'm gonna give you a little bit of the sense of which how we use it, how the microdata is used to infer the use of technology across sectors. The idea being that in the case with no exposed heterogeneity, the theory implied by modality in this differential distribution. So you're gonna, by looking at the bimodality, the extent to which there is bimodality, that tell you something about this importance of this traditional model, how large are the gains from adoption, and how large are the adoption costs and the entry costs. But we have that in the paper. Let me just first do a little bit of the quantitative results first. So what I'll show you now, we're going to be a bunch of pictures. So let me start by showing pictures on revenue multipliers. And that's the type of results that we're going to be having. So this is going to be, I guess, each of these will be a sector in the Indian economy, and these will be the multipliers of different sectors. So I guess a multiplier bigger than one is something that you will desire, so that each dollar of fiscal effort give you more than $1 in final welfare. And you see that these are very heterogeneous. For some sectors, they're going to be even negative. This would be kind of, say, real estate, but they're going to be largest for basic metal, machinery equipment, mining, computer and electronics, electrical equipment. So this part of the intuition, I'm going to go through that. It has to do with kind of upstream sectors would be more important. And that's kind of an intuition developed by Ernest Liu. So there will be some of that will be.
Most of them are greater than one.
Most of them will be greater than one. So meaning that you have large effects. So you can divide that into what is the heterogeneity across sectors. In terms of the subsidy elasticity of consumption, that's the first time I show you. So sectors with high revenue multipliers are going to be sectors on average with high subsidy elasticity, but not necessarily the highest. What also matters is the fiscal cost given by the dollar weight. And I think this one should be without the tilde. You also will be sectors that will tend to be relatively small. So there will be this. The multiplier will be a function of both of the high elasticity, but also relatively cheap sectors in terms of requiring a few fiscal resources. This is a figure that tells you how the multipliers without adoption and with adoptions compare. So x-axis the ranking in an economy with no adoption. Think of this as what you're going to get from Bakian Fari or Ernest Liu. And here is with adoption. So low numbers are good. So the sectors are high in ranking. Again, in here, the sector 11 is common, but then you're gonna have a bunch of reversals. So sector 15, 1, 13, and 14 becomes important. And those gonna be, I guess I should have it. That would be machinery equipment, computers, electronics, and electrical equipment.
Paco,
Yeah.
sorry. So those multipliers for different sectors,
So these are the rank.
the previous slide
Yeah.
is like $1 spent across
So in this case,
across the economy
No, this is $1 spent in
the specific sector.
in basic metals, give you almost $6 of welfare, extra welfare.
In the economy. Okay. All right.
So that's how you interpret this. Just it would be nice to have here what is the multiplier to a uniform policy. That would be a good benchmark. And that would be a much smaller number. So this is gonna be very heterogeneous. Let me give you
One policy at a time.
exactly.
Metals and everything else.
Exactly.
But everything responds in the equilibrium.
Exactly.
Multipliers of the
Those,
stuff. But the only thing that was changed is.
Those will be these, and there will be those expressions. This
Okay.
in this case will be the addition of this production channel and the adoption channel, the TFP channel, and so on and so forth. So we start doing this numerically. Eventually, we learn how to do these linear approximations, and we start checking those. And then we realize that the numerical one we're given that kind of relatively large errors, and then we converge all analytically. But it was a very long, protracted process. But yeah, so those are exact expressions. So this will be the difference between the multipliers on with adoption, without adoption. I give you a sense of the amplification. The amplification will be given these simple expressions, and actually the amplification you can get the amplification will be kind of divided to different terms. I want to just to focus on the second and third. The first one is sort of small. You can get in the back of the envelopes. The second and third has to do with there's a price of adoption effect and a feedback through adoption effect. The feedback through adoption effect is the one that show you this WNTF inverse that will enhance adoption. And this is the extent in which how much of the multiplier you're getting in this economy related to the economy without adoption has to do with the fact that they have this effect of policy on the price of adoption that lead you to more adoption and this feedback effect. And this tells you the feedback effects and the price effect on price of adoption are both important. And they're more or less important for different sectors. We can discuss how much of this difference in ranking has to do with the fact that we look at the investment network versus the production network only. For some sectors, that's important. So it explains some of the change in the ranking. Let me just jump into the alternative policies. So this one here is the same, the multiplier for different policies. The one I showed you before was the red diamonds. And you're gonna get, and the one for the adoption subsidy will be the black circles. They show you the adoption subsidies tend to have much more power than the revenue subsidies. And that's a fact that the cost of adoption, the fact that it requires many fewer fiscal resources is dominating the fact that it has less channels. And then you have that in between the two will be the subsidy to intermediate input. And that's sort of intuitive. When you subsidize intermediate input, has to be better than a revenue subsidy. We're affecting directly sort of the margin that is distorted. And while a revenue subsidy, you're subsidizing both the labor and the intermediate input. So there's a sense in with the revenue, yeah. Nothing. That's why we are dividing by the fiscal cost to give you a sense of. So you had to in your mind is a cost of is this a notion of what is the cost of $1 of fiscal revenues? Then and just tell you how the gains are related to that. If you tell me if you were to be purely lump sum taxes, then the answer should be just look at the elasticity directly. But you say, well, maybe there is, and we don't have it in the model, so that's why we normalize it. Yeah.
Taking on Martin's question, why are you looking? I mean, this is a very Chicago question.
Okay.
Why are you looking at these multipliers as opposed to just do the exercise and see the impact on welfare or total output?
No, they're doing it because we think that the model is incomplete by not having that work out. So we think that it's a good summary statistic. It's more informative than just elasticity per se. So that's the answer.
Does the welfare complement, I mean, the rule not only tell you how much value,
and also because to be fair, for sure in the short run, government resources are fixed. So then it has to be a limit. So in the assumption that there is lump sum tax that we can reassign revenues and get you a better allocation, that's not realistic. So I guess that should be the first answer. And
but I mean, I'm not anti these multipliers. It's fine, but I think once you have all the machinery, you could also add to this to the picture.
Yeah.
Impact.
No, but that was here, no? So I show you this. So this is what that's the subsidy elasticity.
Okay.
And then I think here you care whether they're positive or negative. If they're positive,
Okay.
that's a good thing.
Sure.
So then I guess you say just look at those. Yeah. So we use those.
Quick question about the markups across sectors. The eta is, as far as I understood, they're the same across
Constant.
sectors, but the productivities, they're heterogeneous because of the different thresholds. Now, I'm wondering, the markups that the model implies, are they related to the size of the sectoral multiplier? So can you say that?
No, the markups are just constant by assumption.
But the markup is constant, but the marginal cost is not, the average marginal cost. Because
and also the position in the network is not constant. So the reason why, I guess in my mind, the intuition why this heterogeneous effect is kind of the same. Well, it's not the same, but this result, you don't want to tax intermediate input. So a version of that is if you are taxing them at a constant rate, the effect of that will be much more pernicious the more upstream the sector is. So it's kind of and then the position in the network is kind of what drives these effects. And then the position here both in the production and adoption networks and so on and so forth, and that's where the change in ranking come from. So that's probably so I guess the only thing that was going to show you have 1 minute is that's the type of the fit that we're going to do with the model relative to the data. So when we estimate the model, I guess you have this reduced from estimation. We are kind of choosing parameters to fit the size distribution of firms, and that's where the difference in adoption costs and adoption thresholds and difference in productivity across the two technologies coming from. The fact that we're kind of doing choose parameters, reduce from parameters at least to fit the size distribution over many sectors. So in the paper, we present all those feeds. You're gonna get one point is with relatively few parameters, you're gonna get a good fit of very heterogeneous distribution of size across sectors. And you're gonna have sectors that are gonna be estimated to be more modern, say the motor vehicles or mining, and sectors that we estimated to be less modern in the economy, like wood production. In this case, the parenthesis would be the value-added share of the modern technology in different sectors. So that's what kind of you are backing up with the size distribution of firms. And that for this feed, this exposed heterogeneity is going to be useful. So I'm sort of I'm trying to is how much I'm no, but I'm happy to conclude. So I'm 2 minutes. So let me just conclude and then discuss a little bit of the extension I'll be working on. So I guess we do this to think about this paper as building a laboratory for the study of industrial policy and multi-sector economy, where this adoption has complementary effects and there is amplification of policies. We do an estimation of the model and calibrate it, and I guess the key conclusions that we get quantitatively is that there's a great amplification through adoption. So having an endogenous adoption margin is important, both in how large is the effect of policies, but also in which are the key sectors we want to focus on. Adoption subsidies seem to be the most efficient channel. That was not obvious theoretically, but that's what you get from the calibration. And we're kind of going forward, we're thinking of two applications that are going to be interesting. One application is very literal, is one policies to adoption of clean technology. That's like an example where this binary technology seems to be very attractive. We're thinking on that. And the other one is what Alex brought at the beginning. A lot of the effects you might worry that might be dependent, especially the ranking on whether it's a closed economy or not. And that's because the effects go through this the price of the products. And one reason why in an open economy things might be a little bit different is more open sectors, maybe the price effects will be by definition less important. And that will maybe break a little bit the role of upstream sectors. To the extent those upstream sectors, the price effects are not going to be there because they're going to be more fixed internationally, or to a larger extent fixed internationally. So that's a reason why we think that and we're kind of working on the open economy case.
The other way around, the sectors that have to use domestic inputs and are exporting, maybe in an open economy, maybe more, enhanced by the subsidies.
But
not competing against foreigners, but using domestic inputs that are using the traditional technology. Any subsidies to those traditional technology will reduce my cost, probably.
See, for sure, but what I'm saying is if those the upstream inputs, their price is fixed internationally, then adoption will not have an impact to the prices.
Some domestic inputs, some.
Yeah, and those are the ones that maybe you might want to fix. So the ones that are going to be more non-tradable.
The non-tradable inputs with tradable.
With impact, yeah. So that's sort of the type of things that we think they're going to be important. And so part of it is one sector that show up very prominently in the results is mining, and I have this antagonistic. Some people in development look at the impact on mining and not, and they sometimes don't find big effects. And this is a sector that shows in the input-output structure very prominently. So try to think of why that might be reasonable or not. And maybe those are sectors whose prices are more internationally determined, and this logic might break down. So that's why kind of it's useful to explore that. Yeah.
Well, it's a lot of the construction sector inputs come from mining. So I think that
yeah. So you're saying in mining, this construction is a big input? No.
So mining into construction.
Yeah.
The same as you had some of the metals.
Oh, but that's included here. So input output reflect that. And because of yeah, so and that's, so I guess that appears to be important. Thank you.
All right, so now we're taking 25-minute break for coffee, and we'll be back at 11:15.
Full screen? That's
Sí. Okay. Right. So we're ready to continue with the last two presentations. Now we're going to have Eugenia González Aguado from Toulouse School of Economics.
Great. Thank you very much to the organizers for putting the paper in the program and for a great conference. So this paper is about, where's the clicker? This paper is about labor mobility over the business cycle. And just to start with the main motivation of the paper, we can think of standard theories of labor mobility going back to the 60s and the Mundell theories, by which we think of labor mobility as this mechanism that helps stabilizing economies against adverse macroeconomic local shocks. So just by the fact that it allows workers to move from most depressed areas towards better off areas. But what I want to do in this paper is to explore this role of labor mobility in a context in which we had like two key ingredients. First, in which there are labor such frictions. Why is it important? Because we care about unemployment, and we know that it's costly for firms to find workers, and it takes time for workers to find jobs. So labor mobility, it's important in the sense that it can help these workers finding job opportunities easier, or it's something that we need to take into account when thinking about that. It's also important because we know that the incentive for moving of workers that are employed may differ from those of the incentive of workers that are unemployed. So that's something that we want to consider when exploring the role of labor mobility. And the second key ingredient that I'm gonna add in this paper is that I'm gonna consider business cycles. And in particular, we're gonna focus on what happens during recessions. Why is that important? So I'm gonna focus in the US, and what happens in the US is that during recessions, there's a larger dispersion in any economic outcome that you can imagine, unemployment, for example, across the local economies, like across US states. We see that during recessions, the dispersion in unemployment rates increases a lot. Despite this increase in the dispersion of economic outcomes, what we know is that during recessions, people tend to migrate less. So migration is internal migration I'm talking about. It's pro-cyclical, okay? So that's something that we want to understand and to see what's going on, because if that's the case, then it kind of limits the role of labor mobility because of this decrease in migration. Okay, so what I did in the paper, first I document evidence on the patterns of migration across locations in the United States. And I document that job-to-job movers, that is people that move from a job, say in New York, to a job in California directly without any unemployment spell, accounts for most of this interstate migration. And actually the procyclicality of migration that I was talking about is explained by this procyclicality of job-to-job movers, okay? So this is important to take into account when we're thinking about what happens during recessions with labor mobility. Based on this evidence about these employment transitions for interstate movers, I developed a quantitative model with labor mobility and search frictions, in which we had on-the-job search, and not only on-the-job search, but also search from abroad. What I mean by search from abroad is that you may search for a job in a location that it's different from your current, right? So this worker that is in New York and moves directly to a job in California, it's because he's been searching abroad while working in New York for a job in California. What this allows me is to formalize the idea that during recession, it's true that Incentive to move may increase for some population, especially for the unemployed, because they want to look for better opportunities of finding a job elsewhere. But because we are in a recession, the probability of finding a job decreases, not only for the unemployed, but also for employed workers, because firms have less incentive to post vacancies. So there's this decrease in the probability of finding jobs. This discourages these job-to-job movers, and this is what's going to account for the procyclicality of migration. And then I show that this model, I apply it to the US with 9 census divisions. And I show that it accounts for cyclical patterns. And the final objective of this paper is to quantify the effect of labor mobility on employment rates during recessions. Okay, so if there's no questions, let me briefly show you this empirical evidence that I was talking about the employment transitions of movers. For that, I use microdata in the United States between the 1986 and 2014 from the CEPR. So this is a survey that has a rotating panel, so I can follow individuals across time for a limited time, for most 4 years, and it's a monthly survey. So the good thing about it is that this survey follows people when they move, so I can know all of the economic outcomes like employment, wages, etc., before they move and after they move. And I use that precisely to examine the employment transitions of these workers, whether they move from employment or not, and when they move and arrive to the new location where they are employed or unemployed.
So there's other evidence that I find it useful to think through this, through the model potentially. There's evidence on the China shock and their effects regionally. And my reading from that literature is that that's one can think of a very persistent shock, have very little effects on mobility. So it would be, we think that that evidence would be useful to think about with the model.
That it has limited mobility, but in terms of
they didn't generate, so people didn't move around.
I see.
So and the impact was a rise in unemployment rate.
So I
can curious whether the other shocks to be used to think through the model and the calibration and the.
I see. So I don't use those moments directly in the calibration. I'll show you because well, I'll have this complicated model. I calibrated in the state, so I'm not using like any elasticity of when you move, etc. What I show with the model is that once I shock the economy and we have the business cycles dynamic, it does generate the similar patterns as in the data, in the sense that we do see that during recessions, people move less, but the direction of the flows that we see across, like if you see like across states, they do move to locations that are better off. You see what I mean? So there's like some, the direction of the flows do follow like the economic intuition, even though they move less, when they move towards better off locations. Does it make sense? Okay, so with this data, what I show is that large fraction of movers are non-employed or unemployed at the time of moving. Most of them remain non-employed the period after moving, so when they arrive to the new location. And migration for these people is countercyclical. But as I was saying before, most movers are employed at the time of moving, and about half of interstate transition are job-to-job transitions. For these kind of movers, migration is procyclical, and that's what's going to make total migration to. So,
quick question about the second bullet point. Can you exclude that those people already have a job, but just happen to be unemployed for the period?
So I'm gonna just one slide, and I'll talk about that. Sure. So just to put numbers into what I was saying in the previous slide. So these are, I'm dividing all the movers between these 4 bins, depending on their transition, employment transition. So the first one is before moving, and the second one is after moving. And this is a monthly transition. So I see you 1 month in one state employed. I see you the next month also employed in a different location. So these are monthly transition, same as I was saying, half of it is E2E, and a lot of them are end-to-end, non-employment to non-employment. If I do it instead of 1 month transition, I do it 2 months transition. So where do I see you after 2 months of moving? Or where do I see you after 3 months of moving? That kind of addresses your question. For the E2E, we see that it doesn't change much. But for the end-to-end, we see that they start like finding jobs, so this end-to-end decreases. So these are the bins that I have for the movers. Now, what happens with the business cycle? What happens if I correlate this with standard measures like national GDP or the national employment rate? And this is what I was saying before, that job-to-job transitions are pro-cyclical, end-to-end are counter-cyclical, and the total one is pro-cyclical. We can have similar patterns in our sample if you worry about married people, like just following their spouses, etc. I do the same for only singles, for example, to account for that. By gender, different age intervals. So this finding is robust. Okay, so that's kind of motivating what I want to do, because in the model that I want to build to analyze this kind of labor mobility over the cycle, what I learned from the data is that search fictions are important, and I need to account for that in the model. So the key thing to account for that in the model is that I need on-the-job search and this search from abroad. So this is going to be a key ingredient in the model. And the second thing is that we care about the business cycles, and business cycles are heterogeneous across locations, in the sense that in the model is going to capture that all locations suffer from an aggregate recession. Of the Great Recession, all states suffer, but some states more than others. And this is going to be captured in the model. This is important because this is the ingredient that is going to capture this potential positive effect of relocation of workers, in the sense that workers can move towards better off locations, relatively better off, because we are still in a recession, and this is kind of a positive effect of labor mobility. Okay, just a brief overview of the model. We have a model, obviously, with labor search frictions and multiple locations. Think of n locations, and these locations are going to differ in mainly 3 things: the moving cost across locations. Just think of it as a linear function in distance, so I kept it super simple. The stochastic productivity. I'm going to model this as each location have a different mean of the productivity, and they are all exposed to an aggregate shock, but the exposure to this aggregate shock is going to be different. And locations also differ in the amenities that they may receive, as standard in this kind of models. There's a continuum of ex-ante identical workers that they can be employed or non-employed. Both of them are going to be searching for jobs, either locally or abroad. And wages are going to be set using the sequential auction bargaining that is standard in these on-the-job search models. Firms in this model are ex-ante identical also. So they are just going to be posting vacancies in each location. And this decision of posting vacancies will give rise to endogenous job finding probabilities in each location. And just to generate some heterogeneity across workers, I assume that when they match with a firm, they draw a productivity that it's match specific and that will last for the duration of the match. So at the end, the total production of a worker at the firm is going to be composed of the aggregate productivity in the location I and its own match specific productivity Y. The timing of the model: first, we'll see the realization of the aggregate shocks, some standard exogenous destruction of the matches that generates this transition to unemployment. Then the workers made their moving and searching decision. That is, they decide whether they want to move and where they want to move. And if they stay, they decide whether they want to search locally or they search in another location, and in which one. So one key assumption here is that they can only search in one location, either your own or some other location. Then matching happens because firms are going to post these vacancies and they are going to find workers, they negotiate the wages and decide the workers whether they accept the offer or not. And at the end of the period, production and consumption happens. So let me just zoom in the important part of the timing, that it's the moving and searching decisions. So what happens is that worker first decides whether to move or not. And if the worker moves, then decides where to move. And then I assume that if you move, then that period, you're going to search locally in that new location. If the worker does not move, then the worker has to decide where he wants to search. So that's whether they search locally or they decide in which location they want to search. And I allow this efficiency of searching locally and abroad potentially to differ. Just think of it as being more difficult to search for a job abroad than if you know like the local firms.
The first move and then search, or it can search before?
Exactly. So that's the key of it. So you have the both options. You can either move directly to a new location and you're unemployed in the new location and then you start searching in that location. That's what I'm going to call search locally. Or you can stay in your own location. Either if you are employed or unemployed, you can decide, okay, I'm going to stay and just going to look remotely for jobs in California. And you can do that. If, in that case, if you match with a firm, it's a good offer, then it's when you decide to move with an offer in hand.
So the period after.
Exactly. You move the period. Let me check the timing. So you move at the end of the period. So you move here and then you produce in the new. So that's how I set the timing. Okay, so these decisions are going to be based both on the economic conditions and also in the standard Tay-Shocks of the trade literature. And the way I model it is that you have two kinds of shocks. You have first the moving shock, that is the preference for moving out of your state, just because you're fed up with, I don't know, the weather in Minnesota, then you decide to move out of Minnesota. And then the location shock, that it's, okay, I'm moving out, but I really like California, so I'm moving to California.
So it cannot be that you just love California and that prompts you to so it's
nested. So it's kind of this nested thing that right, if this location, I guess if this location shock for California is high enough, then you're gonna move. Even so, the shock for moving that it's required to move, it's gonna be lower, something like that. So the way, like, why this complicated setup, it's just because it allows me to capture all these four transitions that we observe in the data. How much time I have? When did this start? Okay, so just briefly, like putting into math what I just said in words, let's look at the problem of a non-employed worker. So I start the period unemployed. What's my value as an unemployed worker at the beginning of the period if I started in location I? Then I draw this shock, and no, I'm thinking about your question. I have to check if what I said it's true, that if you get the California shock high enough, then you move, because it's kind of sequential, so I'm not sure it applies. So okay, so I'm unemployed at the beginning of the period in location I. Then I have these two options: I move or I stay, and I need to value these two objects together with the shocks. Then I draw the location shock zeta I for each location. What's the value of moving? Then I have to decide where I want to move. And then this decision is going to be based on the value of searching. This S, I'm going to show you in a second, is the value of searching if I'm unemployed locally in location J. And this is the shock that I have for liking this location a lot. If I decide to stay, then the value of staying is deciding whether I want to search locally in the same location that I'm now, or abroad in any of the other location. And again, I'm gonna value these shocks zeta for each location. Okay, well, and this with the extreme value kind of shocks, you can write this with this analytical form. Next, what are the search values that I'm pointing out here? The value of searching locally and the value of searching abroad. So the probability of finding a vacancy in a given location, it's denoted by lambda. This is an endogenous object. This is gonna come from the posting of vacancies of firms. And this is if you search locally. If you search abroad, then it just multiplied by this parameter to be calibrated, alpha u, that it's, you can think of this loss of efficiency of searching abroad. When matching, it's when you draw this productivity, y, and you're gonna decide to take the job if the productivity that you draw, it's high enough. Okay, so what are these value of searching? If I started the period, let's see, well, if I started the period in location I, and I want to search locally in location J, this means that I'm gonna move to location J, and I'm gonna search locally there. This is kind of the standard search model, because with some probability, I match with a vacancy. If I match with that vacancy and it's good enough, then I'm gonna be employed in this new location. If I don't find a vacancy, or I find one, but it's too bad of an offer, then I stay unemployed in that location. And because I decided to move to this new location, I have to pay this moving cost. This is just a cost that you pay once. What's the difference between searching abroad and searching abroad? That is this bottom equation. Let me point out the differences. First, the searching efficiency that I already talked about. Second, you only pay the moving cost if you move. That is, if you find an offer that you like, then you move, then you pay this moving cost. And if you don't find an offer or it's not good enough, then you remain unemployed in your starting location. You don't have to pay any moving cost. The other difference here is that if you notice here, this moving cost has the superscript A, and this is the general one. This is just to allow for the moving cost if you move to employment. So you know already that you're moving to a particular firm to be different than if you move to unemployment. And we can rationalize that just by thinking that the firm where you're moving facilitates some moving costs or things like this. So that, again, this is a parameter that I'm gonna calibrate that is gonna tell me whether the moving cost, if you move directly to employment, is different than if you move to unemployment. Okay, and similar for employed workers, I'm not gonna enter into the details. The only thing that I want to point out for the problem of the employed worker, so this is a worker that starts employed the period in a given location, is that if you decide to just move out of your location, you're gonna move to unemployment in the new location, right? And if you stay, you search abroad and you find an offer, then it's going to move job to job. So that's the only thing that you need to remember about the problem of employed workers. Then we arrive at the end of the period. All the matching and moving decisions have already happened, and then we arrive to the production and consumption stage. So at the end of the period for an unemployed worker, its value is gonna consume some home production or unemployment benefits B. For simplicity, I assume that it's homogeneous across states. You consume the amenities from that location, and then the continuation value that it's, again, all these moving decisions. Well, wages are set in equilibrium as these piece rates that tells you the fraction, you negotiate the fraction of the total output that the worker is gonna keep and the firm is gonna keep. So the value of an employed worker that ends the period in location I, it's just gonna be its wages, it consumes the amenities, and the continuation value that depends on whether you receive the shock of separation, exogenous separation or not. Okay, and the problem for the firms, it's also very standard. I just want to point out one thing about the question.
Do you have time to tell us a little bit about the protocol of sequential bargaining?
Sorry?
Do you have time to tell us a little bit about the protocol of sequential bargaining?
I'm not gonna click in the bottom. I don't want to bother him, no. But I can tell you that I have some simplicity assumptions. I assume, for example, that the firm doesn't know where you're coming from or where you are searching from. So that simplifies my life in the sense that the wage does not differ depending on whether you're searching from. It's because it's going to be computationally expensive, but then it's the standard one. So it's kind of then you can think of the nice bargaining kind of protocol or game for unemployed, and for employed, it's this thing about the two firms are going to compete for keeping the worker, and then the wage of the worker is going to be a linear combination between the maximum wage that you can attain in your previous firm and the one in the new firm. So that's the result of the bargaining. Okay, so yeah, I was telling you that I want to just point out one thing about the problem of the firm. It's the standard in this kind of search models, but what I want to point is that critically the continuation value of the firms will depend on the exogenous separations. Again, this is a standard, and endogenous separations because we have job-to-job transitions. So you can think of workers separating from the firm because they find an offer somewhere else. And what labor mobility adds to this problem is that we can think that it could amplify the endogenous separation mechanism just because the more likely your workers are to leave to another location. So if we're thinking in the recession scenario, think of the most badly hit economy. In this economy, the workers are going to be more likely to leave. So this may amplify the endogenous separations that are it's created in this location. This, at the same time, makes firms less willing to post vacancies, so it depresses kind of this economy even. So this is what I will refer to this amplification of endogenous separation effect in the bad location. But then firms will post vacancies taking into account this value at a given cost. They have to pay a cost kappa to post the vacancy, and there's free entry of firms in each location. So this will define the equilibrium market tightness in each location by the simple equation that equates the cost of posting a vacancy with the value of the expected value of filling that vacancy. Equilibrium is defined standard. The only complication, a complication in the model is that you need to keep track of the employment distributions. Why? Because firms need to know whether the vacancy that they are posting is going to be filled by an employed worker, unemployed worker, and from what location. So of course, this complicates the computational algorithm to solve for the equilibrium. I use some methods that allow for tackling this issue by approximating parametrically the employment distribution, but I'm not going to enter into the details of that. Then I calibrate the model to the US census division. So this is only 9 locations, and I use a standard simulated method of moments to match some key moments in the distribution. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 kind of sets of moments that are important: standard labor market moments, the productivity in each location, and some migration. So I'm going to assume that this match-specific productivity just follows this distribution, and for the labor market parameters are kind of standard. I want to get the transition rates in the aggregate, unemployment replacement rate, job-to-job transitions, of course, is going to be important, the wage distribution, and a measure of vacancies to unemployed. Now, for the productivity process, I assume that it follows this standard AR1 form, with each location having a different average productivity. And the other difference is that each location is going to be affected by the aggregate shock. This epsilon is the aggregate shock. Each location is affected differently, such that this is going to get the different sensitivities as in the data. And it's going to allow me, by having this negative correlation between the sensitivity and the average productivity, it's going to allow to capture that during recessions, there's the increasing dispersion in the productivities, in this case, in this economy.
Differences in persistence.
No, I'm not. I mean, I guess I could, but I haven't checked if it's really different across states. And this data on productivity, I'm just getting it as output per worker from the BA. Okay, maybe more interesting, it's how I choose the moments to determine the migration parameters. For the migration cost, I assume that they are symmetric and just given by this linear function on distance. So I'm just going to use the migration rate and the correlation between the distance and flows across these locations as moments. And then I'm going to put attention into these elasticity, like scale parameters for the shocks in the location preference shock and the moving or staying shock, and the cost of moving of searching abroad. I'm going to give briefly some intuition about that. Have 10 minutes? No, 15 minutes? Sorry, okay. Okay, so with the extreme shocks, how I model these moving decisions, I get this expression for, in the model, what's the probability of quitting your current job for moving to another location. This is going to depend on the value of moving to that new location. That it's, remember, if you move as employed, you can just quit your current job to move to unemployment. So this is the value of moving to that new location. And this is the value of staying. That depends crucially on the wage. Now, think of this worker that is employed and decides to quit its job to move to another location as unemployed. So this is going to be a transition that it's E to N. This worker is giving up its wage, its current wage, just to move to unemployment. So naturally, the higher the wage of this worker is, the less likely the worker would be to quit and to move. And given this formula for the probability of quitting, we see that this parameter plays a key role in this decision of whether to do this kind of transition or not, in the sense that it captures how much one cares about giving up your current wage just because you really liked to move to a new location. So for this reason, I target as a moment the wages of these people that move E to N relative to the average wage in the economy. We do see that on the data, these people have on average a 21% lower wage than the average wage in the economy, and this is going to be a key moment to target in the model. Similarly, we get the expression for who gets to move as unemployed to a new location. And once we have pinned down that other parameter, then we're kept with this new parameter that is the scale parameter of the location preference shock. And for targeting this shock, I'm using as a moment the percentages of movers that are non-employed relative to employed before moving. And another parameter that I need to identify, it's the difference between the moving cost of moving to unemployment and the moving cost if you move to a job employed. I was telling you before that maybe we can think of this difference as just the firm providing like it makes it easy for the worker to move. And so for what moment I use for pinning down this parameter, think of the wage accepted if I move to a new location. In general, it has to be higher because you need to compensate for the moving cost, right? So I only accept, if I do this kind of transition, I only accept the wage if it's high enough that it compensates for moving. So the higher this tau A is, the higher the accepted wage it has to be for a moving. So what I do in the data is that I compare the wages of these workers that move end to E, so that I'm unemployed, I'm searching abroad, and I find a job. So I do this end to E transition, and I see that they are on average 10% larger, so that we can think of this compensating for the moving cost. Okay, so well, in the previous tables, I didn't get into much detail, but the model does kind of well in matching most of the moments. So that's kind of a success of the model. But next, what I want to show you, it's what I use the model for. Well, we can use the model for understanding some of the model mechanisms. First, who moves and when moves, when we have this heterogeneity in employment status and on wages and productivity. And critically, I want to talk to you about the model mechanism that generates this procyclical migration. And then I move to the counterfactuals when this kind of work in progress, but I'm looking at the role of labor mobility. Of course, that's the first question that I want to answer, and the role of searching abroad. This whole like model that includes this searching abroad. Why do we need it for? Okay, just let me jump directly to the procyclicality of migration. So as I was mentioning at the very beginning, the model I calibrated in steady state, so I don't use any cyclical moment. And the model still is successful in capturing the cyclical patterns, meaning that it captures that migration in this model is procyclical. This procyclicality is coming from the E to E movers. And if we look at the end-to-end movers, it's countercyclical. What? Okay, it's I can move there, but it doesn't match very well. I mean, yeah, as I was. So this, it's much lower. I think this was like 0.2. And this, it's much lower. So this one, it's getting like very counter-cyclical compared to it. But what's the model mechanism behind these qualitative patterns? In recession, we have an increase in end-to-end due to the reallocation of unemployed towards better areas, more productive, relatively more productive locations. What happens in recession too is that the job-to-job transitions decrease. Why? Because we're in a recession, so all the firms like find it optimal to decrease the posting of vacancies. That affects all locations, so this lambda I decreases everywhere. Because of this lambda I decreasing everywhere, we know that the probability of finding a job, if like you can search abroad more, but the probability of finding a job, it's still low. So the opportunity of this worker to move into it is going to be low. So that's what creates this decrease in job to job. Important point here is that standard models of migrations in which we either have no such frictions or only unemployed can move cannot account for this procyclicality. Okay. Now let's look at some input response. Okay, what happens when there's an aggregate negative shock? This is the productivity in each location. So I'm highlighting in green the least affected location and in red the most affected location. And because we have these differences in the sensitivity to the aggregate shock, some locations are going to suffer more than others. We have the standard, well, what we could naturally think that would happen, that is that the population decreases in the bad location and increases in the good location. Standard also decrease in employment rate. I mean, you cannot really see well, but the difference with standard models is that with labor mobility, we don't get a one-to-one relationship between the decrease in productivity and the decrease in employment rate, meaning that the worse off location, it's not necessarily the one in which employment rate decreases the most. And this is the market time, so the job finding probabilities. But now more interesting, maybe it's what happens with the moving probability. Yep.
I don't want to take away too much of your time, but can you just mention how the model does in matching like the standard business cycle facts of like employment, vacancies, unemployment? Because if I remember correctly, then the standard search model has trouble matching these facts when you feed an aggregate productivity, like Scheimer puzzle and all this.
Exactly. So as of now, how the model is built, it's not built to tackle the Scheimer puzzle. So I have the standard problem of the volatility of unemployment not being high enough. And I can think of ways of solving this as the standard ways of solving the Scheimer puzzle, work in progress.
Good question. Is the model not symmetric, right? The response to a positive shock will be potentially different, right?
True. That's something. Yeah. I cannot give you an answer to that. Unfortunately, I haven't checked the opposite input response, but that's on the to-do list. Yeah. I'm assuming that I'm guessing that it's not symmetric. Yeah. Yeah. There's too many nonlinearities. Exactly. Yeah. But that's something I have to check. Okay, so how do the moving probabilities change? Here we have the probability of moving end to end that we can recover from the model. Again, we would expect that it increases in the regions that are bad. Remember that the red is the one that I'm labeling like the bad location, the worst of location, and it decreases in the best locations. Now, so this kind of the reallocation effect of labor mobility. The probability of searching abroad, maybe more surprisingly, increases everywhere. But even if there's this increase in the probability of searching abroad, again, with this mechanism that in recession, the job finding probability decreases, then we get that the probability of moving, if you search abroad, decreases, okay? And this is, again, what generates the procyclicality. Okay, let's look at the counterfactuals. And again, this is a bit work in progress. The first one that I'm thinking about is to explore the role of labor mobility. Natural exercise would be, okay, what happens if I change the moving cost, right? What happens if I allow people like to move like at a lower cost or at a higher cost? And how does this compare with the baseline economy that I calibrated here? And the second one is like to study the role of searching abroad and see what happens when we don't have searching abroad. So let's just look at this counterfactual in which I took the extreme and I put the cost of moving super high. So we don't have labor mobility basically in this economy, but this is the only parameter that I'm changing in this counterfactual. A bit surprisingly, what happens is that if we compare the drop in employment after a negative productivity shock, the solid black line would be the baseline, what I showed you before, this in the aggregate, and the dashed orangey line is in the counterfactual. So what I find here in this counterfactual is that actually the drop in employment is lower in the case where we don't have, slightly lower in the case where we don't have labor mobility. So this, just to put it like in a sentence, we could think of it as an amplification effect of labor mobility, of recessions. Where is this coming from? Where endogenous separations that are gonna play a role in the sense that if I'm in the bad location, I'm a firm in a bad location, I know that my workers have a higher probability of leaving, and this is gonna generate more separations at the firm that without labor mobility. So there's this amplification of endogenous separation effect. There's also kind of a composition effect that it's that some workers are gonna move E to N from the most affected location. So that this is just gonna increase the unemployment pool. And also the decrease in search efficiency because more people want to search abroad. Searching abroad is less efficient than searching locally, so this will also depress like the posting of vacancies of firms.
Yeah, can I think about this as a pure relocation shock? So if there are to be like no aggregate effect, but then you tell me that it's a increasing the dispersion of shocks, then there will be relocation. And since it's labor friction, that relocation should be associated with a decline in employment. Yeah.
Just because they are, this would be true if they are relocating through unemployment, no? Because.
Well, no, sure, but so the productivity decreases in some location, increasing others, so the aggregate is constant. And now you're going to have some workers go from one location to the next. They have to go through the frictional labor market, and that should be along the should be a transition.
But I think the case that you're thinking about, if I am understanding correctly, it's when in the net there's no aggregate productivity loss. Here I'm considering a recession. So in the net,
but on top of that, there's a dispersion of that.
Sure.
I guess, but that's already there in the no. With no mobility, I cannot act upon that.
Sorry, with no mobility.
No mobility is not there will not be flow of worker from one location to the one with the worst shock to the one with the best shock,
Yeah.
because you don't allow for that.
Mhm.
So then in that world, so some of the lower employment is a consequence of the relocation through a frictional labor market.
Exactly. That's true.
So some of the effects is that.
Some of the effect is that for sure, yeah.
Holding fixed posting and so on and so forth.
Ah, I see. So that's
Then there's an effect here.
I see.
They're much more richer because there's posting and maybe the first post.
Yeah.
With,
So I
try to
could check
understand
that.
how
I
much
could
of
check
the
that in a I didn't check. I could check that in a counterfactual in which I keep so I analyze the dynamics, but keeping the job vacancy posting fixed at the same state, and then see what happens with labor mobility. No,
and unemployment, because maybe there's more unemployment.
Exactly.
There's a relocation. There's frictional.
Exactly. I tried to do a similar thing, but kind of the opposite, that it was like what happens, I don't have it here, but what happens if I keep the moving probabilities fixed at the state to see how much of the changes in employment are just due to changes in the decision of moving during recessions versus during booms. But yeah, I could do also. Yeah. Okay, so I have to kind of rush up a little bit. Here is just to mention that the effects of these, the difference between the case with no labor mobility and labor mobility are heterogeneous across locations. So here I have the drop in employment after a negative productivity shock in the baseline economy and in the no mobility economy. So let me read it because I always get confused. If it's below the 45-degree line, then it means that the drop is smaller with labor mobility than without. So they benefit from labor mobility. And this is just to show you the mechanism that I was talking about, the endogenous separation. Firms' incentive to post vacancies depend on this per period profit. This decreases because of the decrease in productivity. But also depends on the expected duration of the match. And this increases, so if we forget about quittings, that they are also in the model, but just to make the point, just in this argument, suppose that there are no quits. So the expected duration of a match in recessions may increase just because we have fewer job-to-job transitions. Okay, but let's look at what happens in the least affected location. So this is the drop in endogenous separation in the least affected location, and this is the most affected location. And here we see a difference between the baseline and no labor mobility. In the least affected location, the endogenous separation dropped by more in the labor mobility case. Why? Because the workers are already in the good location, so they don't want to move to a worse off location. And the opposite happens in the most affected location, that the endogenous separation dropped by less in the labor mobility than in the no labor mobility. And this is all due to these moving probabilities. Why? Because in the most affected location, we're going to have an increase in endogenous separations that are due to workers moving to somewhere else. So this decreases the total endogenous separations by less than in the least affected location. So this means that the expected duration of a match in the most affected location, it decreases by more in the labor mobility case. Something to take into account is just that by changing the cost of moving, that is what I'm doing in this counterfactual, I'm changing a lot of things. One of the important things that I'm changing is that this change in the moving cost is going to affect unemployment and unemployed and employed people differently. So it's going to change the composition of movers. Before I was telling you that half of the interstate movers are job to job. What happens if I decrease the cost of moving, I'm going to decrease the amount of people that move job to job, and I'm going to increase the amount of people that just move to unemployment just because it's so cheap and I like to go to California. I'm going to move to California even if I lose the job. So this is just to keep in mind that by changing the cost of moving, if we want to analyze these effects, we need to keep into account that this is going to change the composition of movers in terms of the employment transitions. Okay, and I think I need to kind of conclude. So just to point out the role of searching abroad. Why do I bother to put all this machinery into this model? Well, if we have no searching abroad in the model, what we would get is a counter-cyclical migration, so that migration increases during recession. And of course, this is counterfactual. We don't see that in the data. And we would also see, if we want to compare like policies that changes the moving cost, we would see a big amplification effect of labor mobility. Why? Because now workers cannot move job to job, so they're just gonna move to unemployment, and this is gonna generate a large decrease in employment rates. Okay, so let me just conclude with that. What I show you is that in the data during recessions, people move less, and it's kind of a puzzle in the literature, even if differences across locations are larger. I provide a new framework in which we can analyze this cyclicality of migration, in which the key ingredients are search frictions on the job search and search from abroad. And with that, we can account for the patterns of migration. Now, the next objective of the paper is to account for the role of labor mobility. What I find is that due to search frictions, labor mobility could exacerbate the effects of recessions, but the effects are very heterogeneous across locations. That's all for me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Eugenia. Now we have the last presentation by our very own Alessio Moro, our host from the University of Cagliari and CEPR. Alessio.
Thank you, Javi. So thank you to the other organizers for having me on the program. Okay, so this is still a preliminary work that I have with Phoenicia, who is there, and Michelle in the far Australia. And it's a project that is literally evolving every day. So this is where we are today. Maybe, probably due to your inputs on Monday, it will be a different paper. So there's a lot of debate, we all know, about the impact that automation and artificial intelligence can have on the future of jobs. This is in the press. This is some recent articles by this year. As you can see, not all concerns are for middle-skilled or low-skilled jobs. There's also machine or robots that are substituting high-skilled jobs. This BBC article, for instance, which is I think it exemplifies the type of shock that we are thinking about in this paper. So this article talks about a warehouse by Ocado in Luton in the UK. So there are 44 robot arms who handle 15% of the products that go through the facility every week, which is like 400,000 items. They forecast that in 2 years, this proportion could be 70%. All right, so they say that some robots cannot perform some tasks yet, like taking a bottle, because it's a delicate object. But in 2 years, I mean, you improve the software, they will be able to do that. So the type of shock that we have in mind is a large shock that might arrive suddenly. And so the question that we ask is whether there is space for technological unemployment, that is unemployment generated by technological change, in a way that is somehow different from the past. Okay, so this term was coined by Keynes long ago, 100 years ago. And it seems that it was never a big concern over time. A lot of technological change, unemployment, not big spikes. So to fix ideas, we think of technological unemployment both as structural unemployment. So you change the structure of the economy because there are some innovation in technology. And then you go to a new steady state where employment and unemployment can be different. And the other is frictional unemployment. How do you go to the new steady state? So what's the transition about? And we are thinking more about this type of unemployment, but of course, our model will say something also about the steady state effects. So we know that the friction unemployment can be determined by many factors, search, matching, institutional factors. What we want to focus here is skill mismatches. So what is different from the past? Those articles and the debate in the last 10 years or 20 years in economics is that technological change that generated such huge reallocations in the occupational structure is sort of different from the past. It's not so much a productivity effect, is a task replacement type of technology. So technology or machines or capital, whatever, directly substitutes labor in specific tasks. So this is the first thing, which we're not the first, of course, to emphasize this. And the second, which we think it's a novel observation, is that training requirements to perform certain occupations increased over time, especially in the last 15 years. So this is driven, I'll show you a graph in a moment, by high-skilled occupations. So this increase is localized in high-skilled occupations. And so if we think that switching occupation is costly and is usually associated with longer unemployment spells, well, a recent paper documents this fact, you can think that the length of these unemployment spells is also correlated to the training required to the occupation you are switching to, so the receiving occupation. And indeed, we find that our measure of training is, so the unemployment spells are correlated, their length, with the training requirements in the receiving occupation. Using IPUM's data, we find this positive correlation. So this is what I'm talking about. On the left, you have this that we call training index, which is, you can interpret this as the average training time required by the representative worker in the economy to perform the representative occupation. So this index tells us that the average time, so beyond like compulsory education and the education that most of the population has, so we compute that to 12 years. So beyond that, the average training time increases from 2006 to 2019 from 8.3 to 9 years. And in a left graph, so we plot this index for 3 broad occupational categories, the typical low, middle, and high skilled. And you can see that the increase is due to high skilled. So the increase in the aggregate index is due to the fact that high skilled occupations are increasing their share in the economy. And also within each occupation, the training requirements are increasing over time. Okay, so in economics, maybe you are familiar with this discussion that to get a tenured position, times has increased, because now you have to do a pre-doc, a PhD, and then a postdoc, and then maybe an assistant professorship. So this seems to be true for all high-skilled occupations. And so is this an issue? Well, these are also expanding occupations. So the idea here is that you have to abandon, for some reason, middle and low skilled occupations. I mean, the pool of expanding occupation is the high skilled, but it's more difficult to reach them. So unemployment spells could be longer, and aggregate unemployment could be larger. So in this paper, we try to tackle this issue by building a quantitative model of robots/capital. I will be more specific on that. Occupations, unemployment, and technological change, where the key ingredients are technology happens mainly with an increase in the tasks that are performable by robots, or capital if you prefer. So in these occupations, the effect is that labor is typically displaced, so there is less labor over time. And the other key ingredient is the switching occupation is costly and takes time. So we will have a training function that will allow the agents to be reallocated to other occupations, which depends on the unemployed pool at the time, so the people that are around without a job, but also the training time of people already in those occupations who are gonna train the new workers. And there will be a parameter which will give the importance of this training. And so transition across occupation will be determined by how much you want to invest in training new workers. And by doing this, you are pulling resources from productive activity for these workers. So quickly related work, we fit into the task-based approach to technological change. Recently, last 5-6 years, there's several papers addressing this issue through robots adoption. We relate, of course, to the literature on occupational switching costs, and we also emphasize the substitutability between capital and labor, which as an important factor in these transitions. So this is just a sample of all the papers in the literature. So let me jump to the model. So there's a continuum of agents between 0 and 1, and at each point in time, each of these agents is working in an occupation. There's a number of occupations in the economy, or the agent is unemployed. So unemployment is simply 1 minus all the people that are working in some occupation. So this is one of the key ingredients in the model, which is the transition law for occupation size. So this is saying that the workers in occupation K at time t+1 are those that were already in that occupation in the previous period, less some separation rate, and plus the new workers. And this is a death rate. So each period, a fraction cap of the population dies and is replaced by new workers that enter in the unemployment state. So to produce, let's use this term, new workers for occupation K, you have a training function which depends on the pool of unemployed at T, and this is the effort or time of workers already in occupation K that is put into training new workers. So this gives you the amount of new workers per existing worker already in the occupation, right? In fact, here this is multiplied by the current size of the occupation. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So in this model, you have to flow into unemployment before entering another occupation. Yes, there's no job-to-job transitions. So the barriers to mobility are given by this 1 minus phi k. So the larger the 1 minus phi, the more important is the training time of people already in that occupation. I mean, you invent Google, you want to hire a lot of engineers. I mean, it's very important that you train them. So, and you have to, at the beginning, take engineers that created Google to teach them, and then slowly you can increase the pool of workers for Google. So in our calibration, we estimate this parameter. This will be larger for high-skilled occupation, 1 minus phi, smaller for middle skill, and the smaller level is for low-skilled occupations. In the extreme, if this is 0, I mean, you can send people to that occupation without any training. You just pick unemployed people from the economy and put them to perform that occupation. We allow for separations rates that are different across occupations, phi's that are different across occupations. Yeah, and this is the heterogeneity in this transition, in these transitions. So agents belong to a household. So it's the household that takes decisions on agents' actions and on how many people to have in each occupation for the next period. So this is the utility function of the household. So in equilibrium, this is an equilibrium object already. Consumption, there's perfectly sharing consumption. So this is equal for all of them. And this utility from labor. So there is some weight. This is the size of the occupation, K. So how many people are there at time T? And LK is the amount of time that each person in that occupation is working. The resource constraint is like in a one sector exogenous growth model standard. So there is investment in capital/robots, which is a sort of standard, and the other constraint for the household is the law of accumulation of workers in each occupation. So note that this amount of labor is the total labor by the agent, by each agent in occupation K, but this is split between training and the rest production. And I will tell you about production now. So we have occupations. This is basically the setting in many papers of Acemoglu and Restrepo. So an occupation is like a set of tasks aggregated through a CES aggregator. So there is some output of the occupation, which is this CES of tasks. So a production of a task can be performed through labor or robots. So the assumption is that robots exist only in a subset of tasks. All right. And note that rho here is the elasticity of substitution between tasks. Now, typically, what happened? Typically, in this literature, there are a few assumptions to solve the problem of the firm that has to decide how much labor and robots to send in each task. All right. So there are a few assumptions. One, there is an exogenous set of tasks in which robots exist from 0 to I hat, and the rest robots do not exist, so you can only employ labor there. This is just a symmetry assumption for tasks. All tasks are weighted equally. And then there is this condition which says that capital is sufficiently cheap such that if the technology exists to perform that task, for robots to perform the task, you employ robots there because they are cheaper than labor. And being perfect substitutes, you only employ robots in those tasks, and you only employ labor in tasks where robots do not exist. So under these assumptions, you can derive the equilibrium production function for the occupation, which is given by a CES aggregator, where now the elasticity of substitution across tasks becomes the elasticity of substitution between total robots that you employ in the occupation and total labor that you employ in the occupation. And the weights of the two inputs depend on the fraction of tasks that robots can perform, the I hat, and this is the complement. So I, big I is the total number of tasks that is in each occupation. And also by alpha, alpha is the productivity of robots in each task, which we assume to be the same for all tasks.
How was it? Which was rho should be bigger than, I guess, 0, less than 0?
Oh, yeah. You want to know the range?
No, just about
so the elasticity we're gonna estimate for the three occupations, and the preview is that it's low substitutability, so complements for low and middle skill. Sorry, the other way around. Substitutes for low and middle, and complements for high skilled in the estimation.
And 0 is the threshold, no? Cobb Douglas in this case. 0.
And 0, so yeah,
I guess.
Yeah. Exactly.
So bigger than 0 for the one and
for the substitutes
0.
and smaller, yeah.
I have a question about the training function, the pi k that you showed in.
You want me to go back?
Oh, you don't have to. So there you say that you need labor that is already employed in occupation to train new workers that enter this occupation.
Yeah.
Now, I guess it's an important assumption. Is this obvious that this is really how it works, how workers are retrained, that you have to give up some of your production workers in occupation K to train the new incoming workers? Because, I mean, it has important implications. When, for example, there's a small occupation with only a few workers, then it will be very costly to reallocate the workers to this occupation, because you have to give up some of those that are already there. So I guess the cost of retraining therefore depends on also the size of the occupation.
Yeah. So if you are asking if we have empirical evidence on that, no. The answer is no. It's just a theoretical assumption. I think it's reasonable. So the Google example is like you come up with this big innovation, but I mean, it's two of you who invented it. I mean, you have to train people to work on it, to develop new features and stuff. At the beginning, it's two of you. You can train 10, then maybe
I understand
20. So I think it's a reasonable assumption, especially for high-skilled occupations.
Would it matter a lot if instead you say that the training is done by, say, a bundle of other people employed in different occupations, or even people could be trained by robots, because then you don't have this trade-off?
Yeah, we didn't think about that. I'm sure it changes, but so a bundle of people from different occupations. So you're thinking about a university, like
it's general skills.
Yeah, I'm sure there are differences. So here we just wanted to capture a slow transition somehow, and we thought this was a reasonable way to go, because the transition works a lot through wages. So if I'll show you the simulation. If wages go up a lot for high skilled, maybe because there's the technological innovation and you want to send a lot of people there suddenly, but still you have to pay people. Yeah, it's costly. So maybe it's not optimal to do so quickly. Indeed, this is what happens in this model. So yeah, maybe if you don't like this assumption, or you think this assumption is not empirically true, maybe you don't like the results. But
I like both things.
some evidence about that. Okay. Yeah.
Alessio, just one quick question was on the training function. So all unemployed needs to retrain, even if they come in and out of the same occupation.
Yeah, that's the assumption. So you can think that, so not all people that are trained or the unemployed pool ends up being a new worker. So you can think that the best ones, or those that already have some knowledge from before, are the ones that are retrained immediately, and the ones that it might take more time. So and so total output in the economy is an aggregator, a CS of all the occupations that you have. Well, the relevant parameter for the occupation is the I hat. So how many tasks are robotized within the occupation? Sigma is I think it's 0.3. I think we take from your estimates. It's bigger than 1. What? I don't remember. It's 0.23, I think. Yeah. So to summarize, the household at each T picks consumption, total amount of work of each agent in occupation K, how much of that goes to training instead of production, how many robots to have at T+1, and the occupation size at T+1. And this is just how labor of workers in an occupation is optimally split. So what's the
Also, to internalize this cost of training.
Yes.
So there would be a dynamic decision.
Yes.
But I'm going to possibly form some workers in one particular occupation to train the new cohort of workers, right?
You can, yes, yes.
Okay,
It's optimally chosen by the household.
Okay.
It's like a planned economy. So like, for instance, Michelle prefers to present like the planner economy. I prefer to present household and firm. I think it's more informative for you. But in the end, it's like a planned economy. Yeah, where the social planner is deciding according to the constraints, so constraint efficient.
Sorry, is technical to train that they're entering the welfare.
If there is any disutility for them, no, they don't have any disutility. So there's only disutility from working. So if you are working in occupation, you have a disutility for work. That's the only margin. Yeah.
And just hit. So I cannot, the household cannot separate workers from one sector to another. Or to unemployment. Given that the margin is that you have to go to unemployment, I have to wait for the job to be exogenously destroyed.
Yes. So
the only margin is the trainings to you, which you can set to 0, and then wait for all these people to be laid off.
But I'll show you that in the simulations. So so basically you are saying, what if the planner or the household could choose this?
That I have too many guys.
Exactly. Sure. So this means that you want to, let's say you want to increase this separation rate because you want to put them into unemployment faster. Okay. Before doing that, what you can do is to set this to 0, right? So if this is, let's say, a constraint that I'm not allowing to, I should see in my simulation that this goes to 0. And maybe he wants to separate more, I don't allow him because it's exogenous. But this does not go to 0 or close to 0 in my simulations. It's always positive. So you're saying it's too high, maybe? I don't know. Yeah, this we calibrate. But in principle, we thought about the other thing. Maybe you want to separate faster than we are allowing to, rather than. So if you want to separate slower, I mean, you just increase these and keep the occupation larger.
I would like to relocate workers from occupation 1 to occupation 2.
Yeah, but then you want to speed up.
I'm not train anyone in occupation 1 and wait for the separation to do its job.
Exactly. That is if you want to speed up the transition. But we in the simulation, this never goes to 0, meaning that the planner doesn't want to speed up the transition more than he is doing. So we don't think that this is a constraint. So even if we were to allow that to be a choice variable, we don't expect the planner to speed up the transition. And the reason is that the matches are valuable. Even if you want to have an occupation that shrinks, cutting matches, if you want to call them, is costly because you are destroying something that is productive. So not necessarily you want to do it so quickly that is suddenly all of you go away from this occupation. It's more a gradual process. At least this is what we get from the simulation that I'll show in a second. So the technology shock exercise. Now, this is a big part of the work for us, because how do we identify or pick this technology shock? It's not obvious. You cannot do growth accounting as you do for productivity shocks. So, well, first, two things. We consider two types of shocks. One is both are MIT shocks. So unexpected zero probability shocks that suddenly occur and hit the economy. And all firms, they have the new technology available. So they can produce more tasks with robots than before. It's unexpected. It's one time. So the economy is always perfect foresight. And one thing that we do that we think is informative is compare this to a productivity shock, because as I said at the beginning, the emphasis is a lot. These task shocks are something worse than previous technological change. They can create more employment. They hit the economy. They created job polarization. All this. So let's see what happens in our model if a productivity shock hits and compare it. So the effect of the two types of shocks depends on rho, but in different ways. So let me go back to the definition of the optimal occupation. You see the exponent of I hat, so the task depends on rho, but is 1 minus rho. The exponent of alpha depends on rho directly. So the shocks are mediated through the elasticity of substitution, but in different ways. And the second important thing is that alpha hits the weight on robots, but I hat hits both the weight on robots and the weight on labor with the opposite sign. So key parameters, I already discussed them. One is the phi in the training function. The other two are the tasks that robots can perform and the shock to it, and and the elasticities. So some parameters are set from previous literature. We normalize TFP to 1 and total tasks in each occupation to 1. Then we follow Elisa's paper for the procedure to estimate the elasticities. And of course, we do this with our definition of low, middle, and high-skilled occupations. And we get the numbers I was mentioned before. And then we calibrate the remaining parameters using targets for the 2006 economy. Okay, so the idea is that we take the economy in 2006 and we shock it with a task shock that arrives suddenly. Here you have some more detail about the training index that I presented at the beginning. So we are using this ONET file. And so we are measuring both education, training, on-the-job training, and experience on the job in constructing this measure. And then we use IPUMs to aggregate to three occupation. So this is sort of the definition that you can give of the training index, which is an average training time for the average worker to perform the representative occupation. Then estimating barriers, we take the law of motion in the model. We take logs on both sides, and then we exploit metropolitan areas in the US to this variation to estimate the parameter of interest, which is the phi. We don't have this in the data, so we construct a proxy. So we have the training index for each occupation, for these aggregate occupations. So we can measure, we can observe all the occupations for unemployed people in the area. So we know where they are coming from. So we know the training that they had. We can compute a distance of the average worker for the training required for low, middle, and high-skilled occupation in each area. And so we can use this to estimate phi. So the estimates provide a phi L. So for low skilled, that is very close to 0. This is not true in the data, really, that the training, even to go for a low skilled occupation, is entirely 0. So we assume a small number for it, and we impose this number, which is 0.8, and estimate the other two. And the numbers are, as you expect, according to the training that I showed you before. Now, the shock to I hat, as I was saying before, is not obvious the way you want to measure this. So the way we chose is to say, okay, from ONET, we can observe all tasks that are performed in an occupation at a certain point in time. Okay. Now, from the IFR, the International Federation of Robotics, we have applications of robots, which is tasks that robots can perform. So we create a map. We use a natural language processing to map robots application to task by robots. So in a sense, we are saying, look, these tasks are performed by workers because they are in the ONET definition. So if they are there, it means that the workers are performing those tasks. At the same time, there exists already a technology, some form of capital that can perform those tasks. At the same time, the stock of robots is tiny in the economy. So they are not adopted on a large scale yet. So the shock for us is the existence of these tasks that are replaceable by robots, but still they were not. But suddenly, like in the Ocado example, maybe in a year, all these tasks are performed by robots because Ocado finds that it's more profitable, right? Yeah, okay. So this is the first way. And then, so Michel has another paper with two computer scientists where they are using the GPT engine to do the match. So they are asking the engine to predict which tasks in the ONET are already performed by robots. Of course, this is more of a black box. We don't know how the GPT engine exactly works. But still, I mean, it proved to be a very good classifier for problems of this sort. Yeah.
But that's performed by robots. That at some factory, at some point,
no, it's a definition.
It's like a big fraction of those tasks.
Yeah, exactly.
Are mostly done by workers. I mean,
no,
the question is existence or universality. I mean, whether you know, if you have a factory that you're already automated, your tasks are automated. I have a factory that is not automated. How would this task be classified? Automated because you have it, or not automated because not both of us have it?
No. So the issue here is that there is a potential substitutability. That is, we are classifying tasks that today can be performed by robots because there is a technology to perform the task. But at the same time, we're assuming that is not implemented. So somebody invented a robot that can pick a bottle and move it to here. At the same time, we are assuming nobody's using that. But this is the sort of shock that we are going to feed the model with, because it's a shock that can happen from now to a year from now, or from now to 6 months from here. You know, the technology exists, but nobody is using it yet, or very few factories are using it. But it could be implemented very quickly if they decide to implement it. So
whether the technology that exists is implemented.
No, so in this model, technology is exogenous. So we are really measuring the fraction of tasks that today on paper are performed by robots, but these tasks are still in ONET. So these are tasks that workers are performing, because otherwise they wouldn't be in ONET. Sorry, say again?
It also could be that they have a robot that does something, but it's not cost effective, and that it's not implemented in the model. You assume that it's always cost effective, but reality could be that.
Sure. But so you can see reality as robots are not cost effective yet, so they are not implemented, but the technology exists. So potentially this shock can occur. It's like, okay, let's think of ChatGPT. I mean,
sure, but I can have a robot open the doors for me, and I'm not going to use it because it's very costly, and I open the door by myself.
Sure. Here, the assumption is that the technology arrives and everybody uses it at zero cost. There's no, like in your model, some cost of adoption. Here is just, this is a general purpose technology.
It seems to be the way you measure is it's possible that something is done by a robot. Is it true that's what you're doing?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a task like open the window, opening window, like open the door. If there is an application of robots, there's a robot that where it's written that the robot can open the door, then there is a task that is potentially substitutable by the robot. Do we see robots in firms? No. In general, no. But potentially they can arrive. But so
the cost-effective technologies, like in principle, can be automated everywhere, but it could be too costly to do some of them. So then you choose to do it with workers. In here, you're assuming that either the cost of automation is either zero or flat or very high. So then there is an exogenous threshold.
So the assumption here is different. So robots and capital coincide. So you can think of capital as robots. They are the same thing. What is changing is, I think that what is changing is our ability to reprogram capital. So before you installed a machine, it could do just one task, and that's forever. Now you install a robot, and from one day to the other, you change the software, and the robot can do 10 more tasks with the same machine. And that arrives suddenly, you already have the installed stock of capital, it can do more stuff. This is the way we are thinking. So
the task was cost 0, 1, and it was not feasible the others. And now you can reprogram each task.
Yes.
To make it with the same machine perform a bunch of other tasks for free.
Yes. Exactly. So that's exactly the assumption.
So just to rephrase this, there's an extensive margin. The household decides how many robots to install, and there's an intensive margin that is decided. There's an exhaustion shock that decides what tasks each of the installed robots can do.
Okay, so there's no intensive margin, and it's automatic in the model. If the robot exists in the task, you will use it. But then endogenously, you need to decide how much to change the stock of robots and how to allocate it both across tasks and occupations. So, yeah. So that's why I was using the example at the beginning, because the robot already exists, the machine already exists. You reprogram it from night to day, and it's gonna do 10 more tasks. So this is the type of shock. And I mean, conceptually, to me, I really like the task approach, but I'm not fully convinced that it's something new, because any type of capital historically that you installed was substituting specific tasks of workers, since the Ludists. So you can think of all process of growth that we usually model as a productivity of capital type of growth. You can think of it as a increasing the number of tasks that capital can perform, and an increase in the installed capital because there is more tasks that it can perform. So conceptually, to me, they are the same. So here in the experiment, we are saying like this I hat at a point in time is there. It evolved slowly over time. Now, potentially, there can be a large shock to this I hat. So here is the calibrated parameters where you see three parameters. The order is low, middle, and high skilled. So the initial task that robots can perform is calibrated using shares. So this is low, middle, and high. And the shock that we obtain in the first case is the difference between these values and these values. So it's like 0.06 for low, 0.04 for middle, and 0.02 for high. according to our classification. Recall the experiment is unexpected shock. There's a new steady state. We are plotting the transition towards the new steady state. So the task shock increases total output. So here I'm shocking the three occupations with the shocks that I showed you in the table. They are happening simultaneously. It's not only in one occupation, in the three of them. So it's a productivity effect, output, investment, consumption, robots. This is a stock. They all increase. Robots become more productive. The rental price increases on impact, and then it declines towards the new steady state as you increase the stock. Unemployment does not increase on impact. So this is what we didn't expect. Unemployment actually decreases in the first part of the transition. Of course, in the new steady state, there is more, well, I don't know if it's of course, but in the new steady state, there is more unemployment. Let's see what happens in the three occupations. So in the first row, you have the fraction of the population in each occupation. So the largest shock is here, the second is here, and the third is here. So the population flows to the high-skilled occupation. This increases. This is the time spent in training. You want to move people to the high-skilled occupation, you increase the training time. And this is what I was telling you before. You don't go to zero. You reduce the training time in two other occupations, but you don't set it to zero. So this suggests to me that the household doesn't want to speed up the transition more than he already does. And so, I mean, from these three, you see that there is sort of balanced flow of workers out of two occupations and into the third one. And actually, with the training function, the flow into this occupation is faster than the flow out of these two. That's why unemployment declines in the first part of the transition. And this is, I mean, this is what optimally happens. Here is the shock to productivity compared to the shock to tasks. So how do we do the experiment to have comparable shocks? We calibrate the shocks to the alphas, to the productivity parameters, such that in the new steady state, the output of each occupation is the same as for the task shocks. So occupations enter into output, so total output is the same in the new steady state in the two experiments. So the shocks are comparable. Do I have in the? I should have in the. Yeah. Yeah. So these are the shocks to alpha. These are the initial alphas, and these are the new alphas that are equivalent in terms of output to having the shocks to the I hat. So unemployment, so the dashed line is the productivity shock, the continuous line is the task shock. So unemployment is always larger with the productivity shock than with the task shock. So this seems sort of in contrast with the view that these task shocks are more dangerous for employment and unemployment than historical productivity growth shocks. It doesn't seem the case here. So wages increase more with the productivity shock. So the economy is more productive. There is less robots in equilibrium with the productivity shock, and there is less labor in, at least in high-skilled occupation for the productivity shock. So the economy is more productive. The transition is similar, but you see the change in the occupational structure is less for the productivity shock, which is consistent with what people think is the task shocks that are creating the restructuring in the unemployment composition, so employment polarization, if you prefer. The productivity shocks did not produce that historically, right? So in this model, productivity shocks still produces a reallocation of employment across occupations, not as strong as the task shocks. So this is consistent with the task-based literature on employment polarization, partly because also the productivity shock goes in a similar direction. Then we have an experiment in which, together with the task shock, we give a shock to the barriers. So I show you that the training index is increasing over time. So here we are saying, okay, the task shock arrives. At the same time, it becomes more difficult to enter high-skilled occupation because you require more training. So this is the continuous line is the benchmark case, and the dashed now is the case in which we also shock the phi in the high-skilled occupation. It becomes more difficult to enter those occupations. In this case, there is an increase of unemployment in the transition. And you observe that now the high-skilled occupation does not expand. So even if the task shock is such that you would like to reallocate people to the high-skilled occupation, which is the one that received the smaller shock in terms of tasks, it's harder. So even if training for high-skilled people increases substantially, you train much more to get people into the occupation, but it's difficult, so you cannot really fit many people there.
Right?
Yes, should. Yeah, it should. I think in all these experiments, wages go up and they all go upper for the high skill.
Yeah, and here, given that it's more costly to produce a high skill.
Sure, exactly. And it's more costly to pay them.
Here, the cost for the experiment is that you're increasing the cost of generating a new,
generating new people for
new
the
people.
high skill.
Those who are already in that occupation, they don't need to be
No, nothing else changes. Yeah.
Feel free to defer my the answer because you have only.
Yeah, I have one final experiment. So do I have a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Question about the training of the high skill. Now, I would actually expect that after a task shock, meaning that the robots can perform a larger set of tasks. Therefore, humans will perform a lower set of tasks. So the training actually goes down because you need to retrain people on a lower number of tasks, which should be less costly.
that is not in the model.
Yeah.
So an experiment that we don't do that we plan to do is to increase the total number of tasks. Okay, but something that you have to consider there is that to keep the proportion. So imagine that 10% of the tasks that were robotized, there's a 10% increase more. Now you have to increase 10% the total number of tasks to keep the proportions the same. So this means a much larger number of tasks for humans, which, I mean, intuitively, it doesn't seem the case. But yeah, what you are saying is not here. Maybe it's relevant empirical.
On that data, did you see whether there are more tasks that were rare before that they are becoming more common? That now that there is robots opening the door for Paco. Now Paco is writing complicated models at a higher rate.
Yeah, we look at variation in ONET. There's not much variation over time in tasks. So that was one way that we tried to think of the shock to measure the shock, but it doesn't seem yeah, there is too much variation over time. And so the last thing that I show you in last 30 seconds is that we call it the GPT shock, just because we use GPT to predict the shock. I mean, the shock is huge here because you go from 31 to 62 for low skilled, 34 to 58, 42 to 49 for high skilled. So it's huge shock. To have an idea, compare with the productivity shock, the equivalent productivity shock goes from 2.55, the alpha, to 14.2, 16 for the low skill. So it's really huge, huge productivity gains. But something that I didn't stress, but I would like to. So the difference between the two methods is that it really depends how you want to think about a task that can be performed by robots. For instance, we exclude actions like supervise. You don't think of a robot supervising something. At the moment, I mean, you cannot think of a robot supervising airplanes going around your head, right? In principle, they can do it. Technically, they can do it. You don't think we are going there for some time because maybe there's legislation restriction. But in principle, they can do. You change the legislation, the number of tasks can really increase exponentially. And maybe those numbers are not so crazy. I mean, ChatGPT arrived from one day to the other. How many tasks can perform that we used to do before? I mean, it's really many. Anyways, this is the comparison between the two shocks. Huge differences in output. See how much output increases, investment, consumption, robots. So the pattern is similar. What is interesting is that the transition at the beginning is not so different in terms of unemployment, very similar. It differs when you go to the new steady state where unemployment is much higher. So it seems in this model, the larger productivity, the larger unemployment you want to sustain in steady state. And the reason is that it's the same. I mean, basically the time spent in training is still balanced across occupations because the household is balancing it. So with the large shocks, there's more training in high skilled, much less in middle and low, but the things are balanced. So the flow into high skilled occupations is balanced by the flow out of low and middle, which happens faster for the three of them. Okay, so in terms of are these shocks disruptive for unemployment? Unemployment will skyrocket. In this model, it doesn't seem to be the case. And so this is the DGPT shock plus the barriers shock, but I will stop here because too much time. Thank you. All right, so this is the end of a beautiful workshop for me. I hope for you as well. We have some activities in the afternoon. There is lunch as yesterday, same place. And then at 4, for those who want, we meet at the hotel in the lobby or in front, and we go for a walk. And the idea is to spend the evening with our promenade. And at 8, we directly arrive at the restaurant pizzeria. If somebody is not coming to the walk, just let me know. I'll tell him where to go at 8 so that we meet there for dinner. All right. Thanks again.